The eternal city of Rome, Italy. And it's so much more than just a city. Originally a republic, a great empire, and a warning. It also happens to be one of the most insane true events ever recorded. Because the achievements of Rome didn't require an industrial revolution. They managed to build structures that endure to this day. Structures that officially have lasted for over 1,000 years, and in some cases over 2,000 years. What's really the mystery behind Rome? Why do we consider it an insane true event? Why is it that Rome is at the nexus point of so much historical understanding? Virtually every set of ruins you come across anywhere along the Mediterranean is attributed to Rome. And yet you'll see things that reflect Rome in far-off places such as Singapore, albeit it's a court building or whatever we're calling it today. And then in the United States, in Philadelphia, where you have the incredible City Hall, built in the 1800s, but today would bankrupt the city to tear it down. Join me as we explore the most insane true events ever recorded. The reenactment. And there are reenactments everywhere across the land. The reenactment of the great Roman legions. It reinforces the notion that this incredible empire of Rome existed. And I can only imagine what sort of fun individuals have. I mean, look at how much fun this guy appears to be having. Dressed up in his armor and his helmet, knowing he gets to spend the entire day doing reenactments in the sun. I mean, it must be fun to play a soldier. In the United States, we enjoy our Civil War reenactments, where everyone gets to don the old wool uniforms and march around in the sun all day. It really instills that. I wonder if down the road are we going to reenact the global war on terror? The incessant meetings between U.S. military officers and local officials, trying to come to a conclusion for a new nation. Would anybody want to reenact that? We begin our exploration by looking at the works of Giovanni Panini, an Italian Baroque fantasy painter and architect, 1691 to 1765. A very interesting individual. And he did a lot of artistic works that were considered fantasy on the landscapes of Rome. He was also an architect. Now, was he an architect in his spare time, or was he a painter in his spare time? Well, based on his works, we come to the conclusion that clearly he was a fantasy painter full-time. But when you look at these works that he did of Rome in this time frame, presumably from the late 1600s, well, actually I should say the 1700s, then what was he really representing? Because a lot of his paintings don't represent actual landscapes. They represent a fantasy landscape where many of the monuments of Rome were fictitiously put together in these paintings. But when you look at them very closely, you see a lot of the details that are accurately captured. So what was Panini really representing in these paintings that he did? Yes, the name of Giovanni appearing so many times in different historical documents. No, not that Giovanni, but if anybody understands that reference, let me know. But you see this interesting compilation of these various structures that we consider famous in Rome, with statues and even a pyramid in the background. Now, while it is true that all these structures, or something resembling them, could be found across Rome today, what exactly was he representing? And why does he have other very accurate representations, such as the interior of St. Peter's in Rome? Well, the explanation will be he was a fantasy painter in some works, and in other works he was accurately reproducing exactly what he saw. But is it possible that there could be another explanation for this variety of paintings that this individual did? And why is it that we have the architect profession that's attributed to him? Here we have this painting of his that was apparently looted during the German occupation of Italy in 1944. Very interesting that the Germans would proudly pose with this picture that they had looted, and that this is still on the historical record. I mean, didn't they know that they were losing the war in 1944? And perhaps not. Their state propaganda had told them they were not going to lose the war, they would win, so therefore once they acquired this painting, they were going to pose for it. And there's an easy explanation. Very, very intriguing structure here. Presuming this image is from Naples. Is this a guard post that's very well built, or is it some sort of latrine or bathroom? Going back to the Panini paintings, though, you'll see that there's a compilation of rather unique structures. We have obelisks, we have what we would think of as the Colosseum, we have the ruins of temples, and of course our favorite centaur figure, because why not? I oftentimes question when we see figures such as this, because was mythology really so powerful at the time? And I'm sure the official explanation will be yes, everybody believed in mythology and therefore it was represented. But we also have other paintings that indicate that there's some sort of turmoil or strife that was going on at this time. Now, granted, this is the 1700s, and depending on what your historical understanding of the 1700s is, whether you got it from a university or whether you achieved it from watching Outlander, it doesn't really matter because there's different perceptions of the time frame. Now, of course, you have to consult a certified historian to know exactly what happened in the official history, but I consider these true events to be rather insane true events because of what they represent. Why is it that we have this painter who was doing these fantasy exhibits and these fantasy renditions of Rome? You would think that even in the 1700s one could go walking around Rome and find many wondrous landscapes, and you can see the pictures, the very early pictures of Rome taken by the camera, at least as we understand it, in the 1800s, which shows you that it's most certainly not a boring place. In other words, any sort of painter would be able to find just things that they could paint in their immediate field of view without having to comprise these supposed fantasy paintings. But what I want to suggest is, what if Panini really was representing what he saw? Because we do have different representations of such structures as the Pantheon. The Pantheon which we cannot replicate today, because as we understand it is the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the land. And unreinforced concrete cannot be replicated, because Roman concrete cannot be replicated today, despite all of our great advances in technology and our possession of the incredible and magical artificial intelligence. Although I also find it interesting that artificial intelligence can't replicate these paintings either. You can very easily tell the difference. I'm sure someone will try to argue that point, and who knows, maybe one day it will advance to the point to where it can replicate these paintings. But when you see things like this, and why works of art like this intrigue me, regardless of who they're attributed to, is I have to ask the question, are these really representing something that has been lost in our history? Are we seeing something of Rome being recovered and salvaged? Now, the official history tells us that many times the entire existence and knowledge of the Roman Empire and even the entire Roman civilization was rediscovered multiple times. In fact, in the 1700s, it was one of the times in which it was rediscovered. Now, we can argue whether it was an actual rediscovering. I mean, certainly all these ruins existed across the Italian peninsula for over 1,000 years. And the civilizations, whether they were city-states, the Roman Catholic Church, or whoever, was walking across them every single day and had to see them. Although when you see paintings like this, it causes you to question exactly what sort of reality they were actually encountering at that time. Did they encounter these structures in their full glory, in pristine condition, or had they been grown over? I mean, we've certainly all seen that program, Life After People, where they show that plants and animals quickly cause artificial structures, or man-made structures, to quickly disappear in the increasing foliage. And some of these paintings do give that impression, but they also give a different impression. They give the impression that the structure and the layout of this city was very different. And is that the reason why there is this assessment, this assignment of these paintings all being fictitious? That they were simply from the imagination of Panini, because he's labeled as a fantasy painter. These were not real life depictions. But how disturbing, how troubling would it be if there was an element of realism in these paintings? Or what if, in fact, he was actually painting what he really saw exactly as he saw it? Now, that's merely a supposition. The official history tells us that that did not happen, that what he was painting was merely the product of fantasy. But why is it we have this other affiliation with him of being an architect? There's always the discussion that in the past, our avocations and our professions were used interchangeably. And because apparently people had so much time on their hands, from the 17 through the 1800s, whether you lived in Italy or the nascent United States, you had a lot of time on your hands, for reasons unknown, to where you could actually engage in a profession, an avocation, and have many different pursuits. It seemed as though there was the opportunity for everybody to be a polymath. But really think about it. What do these paintings actually represent? Is it really just Panini using his imagination of transposing all of these incredible landmarks, these structures in Rome, and making fantasy paintings to create an eternal city that was even more eternal, even more grand and glorious than we see today? Or is it representing something else entirely? Is it representing a Rome that was lost? Or perhaps even an entirely other civilization that was lost? When you look at the works, and there's no shortage of works, and Panini is certainly not the only artist whose drawings, paintings, sketches, engravings, whatever we choose to call them today, have reached us in this present day. But looking at them, I think it's important to remember it's supposed to show us how the people of that time viewed their presence and their present situation. One thing that Ken Burns said is that we understand in our present situation, we evaluate ourselves by how we viewed the past. But what that's doing is that's imposing our own perceptions on the past. He's openly saying that we're not seeing the past exactly as it was, and we're certainly not seeing it through the eyes of the people that really lived through it. I think that's important that's an important facet to understand. Because the people who really did live through it, even if the history did happen exactly as we understand it to have happened, they saw it very differently. And how did they really see it? How is it possible that a structure and an interior like this was completed at any time in the past? Are we simply going to accept that logistical impossibilities and that very difficult situations were achieved? I mean, we certainly accept that the Roman civilization managed these incredible and stellar achievements, simply because of the fact that they had infinite manual labor. And, of course, forced labor. That's the official explanation behind it. Forced labor mixed with an incredible engineering understanding. And yet, many of the structures that you can come across in Rome today, such as St. Peter's, they were certainly not built by the Roman civilization, but by the successor civilizations. There was a Renaissance. There were polymaths, such as Michelangelo and Da Vinci, who were involved in the construction and designing of these structures. Of course, I can also say with total certainty that nobody is designing structures like this today. No one is thinking about them. Now let's take a look at Giovanni Piranesi. And here we have a classical archaeologist, an architect, and an artist. And about the same time frame as Panini, another individual named Giovanni. Again, not to be confused with this Giovanni. And here we have another situation of an artist who is also an architect. Now, Piranesi here is famous, and this is apparently a self-portrait. This is a very, very odd self-portrait because some of the most famous self-portraits by artist Van Gogh, he never attempted a profile picture. And why would someone do a picture of themselves in a coin? Well, I guess it does replicate a good Roman coin because there's not a year affiliated with it. But with Piranesi, you'll actually see the same sort of art that you saw with Panini. And yet he's most famous for doing these fantasy drawings of what are called the prisons. Now, once again, the official historical explanation for this insane true event is that he was simply doing a parody, if you will. These prisons represent the political satire of the time, that Italy had been unduly influenced by the Greek influences and Greek culture. Now, that's a very intriguing position to take because when you look at some of these images from Piranesi, you get the idea that once again, he seems to be really drawing, and most of these are drawings, but again, we'll have different names for them, engravings, renderings, sketches. But he does seem to be capturing exactly what he's seen on the landscape. Now, it is true, there is that very intriguing pyramid that you can see in Rome that's not too far from the Aurelian walls. But it really causes you to question the existence of how Rome really was. The Colosseum, the amphitheaters, all the great forums. And why is it that everything seems to mix together there? Well, the city's been around for a long period of time, and there's been numerous civilizations, and they very easily build on top of one another. Although, is that exactly what happened? Or did something else entirely happen when you look at these works of art, whether they're paintings or sketches? And whether we're looking at the works of Panini or Piranesi, we do see the incredible arches that were attributed to Rome. It's also interesting to note, though, that we had no shortage of victory and triumph arches that appeared in places such as the United States. There were many arches that were done after the Spanish-American War and World War I. Now, of course, we're assured that these were temporary structures, but it's certain to say that the victory arches that endure to this day in Rome are certainly not temporary structures. So what is the real situation? What is this really reflecting when we look at this? And yes, people may be annoyed by the questions, but if you just take this all at face value, then you realize it doesn't really make a lot of sense, and it can just be categorized as an insane true event. It's what really happened because it's what's been relayed to us. And maybe that is indeed the situation. Or maybe our reality has some elements of insanity to it. But trying to step back and really deconflict the overlapping events and structures that we see, what's the explanation behind these prison drawings that Piranesi did? Was he really reflecting something that was just in his imagination to communicate some sort of bizarre political satire? Or once again, was he actually reflecting a reality that he was able to truly view? And this is where I think we get the interesting premise behind these works, because if these were reflecting what he was actually looking at, then what was he really looking at? Is it possible that there were subterranean structures that were laid out in this very manner? And if these were structures that did once exist, what exactly happened to them? Were they actually structures that were part of surviving some sort of reset event or some sort of cataclysm? Or did they represent something else entirely? We've had the theories on this channel that it may be possible that there was some sort of incredible event that involved tricking the population to seek refuge in these incredible subterranean compounds, and that once the population had taken up residence within these subterranean compounds, safety was not what they were constructed for. In fact, they were constructed to do terrifying things to the population, whether it was simply killing off the people or doing all sorts of horrific experiments on them. And while this might be the very darkest of possibilities for what happened here, how else would you exactly explain these sketches of these prisons if taken at face value? What if that's exactly what they were? And that the actual replication of what this artist saw when he did these drawings, the only way he was going to get them published was by simply saying that it involved a element of political humor, that you could really say that that's what he was showing? Or could it even be possible that that affiliation and explanation for this artwork was assigned later? That the only way you could explain it was he was simply doing a political satire. Yes, that's the beauty about satire. And of course you can find a great example in modern times of satire by comparing the films of RoboCop from 1987 to RoboCop 2. And tell me which one's the better satire. Tell me which film feels more real between the two of them. And how does that comparison apply here? Well, look at these incredible sketchings. Look at these works of art. Would someone really go to the trouble of replicating this prison? And why is it that there's certain geometric and various impossibilities that are shown if you look closely at a lot of this artwork? Was that the only way it was ever going to get published? Because if you did a completely real and adequate reproduction, would it have ever been remembered if it was something that was never intended to be remembered? Now, of course, people will trust exactly what they're told, and they believe exactly what's been relayed to them, and it may be possible that everything that's been relayed to us is true. And I concede that there is a possibility that, yes, the artist was simply using their imagination to communicate the political events at the time, much in the same way that director Paul Verhoeven was using his imagination to communicate extreme satire in the 1987 film RoboCop. But why is it when you look at works such as this and you try to reconcile them with the historical events that were going on at the time? You understand that the 1700s was apparently a period of transition. It was well after the period of the Renaissance, and so that's how we explain this interesting overlap that we have of some people having knowledge and yet other people still believing in the concept of witches and very superstitious in many ways. And yet you look at these images and you have this really bizarre amalgamation of technology and torment that's being shown. If this is a prison, then what's really the purpose behind it? Or was it actually that structure where people were tricked into going, where they were tormented, and their descendants were tormented? Or could you even say it was a prison compound that was for the surviving prisoners that were taken to the previous civilization? And this is where they were relocated and where they were controlled and re-indoctrinated before the survivors were allowed to go out and repopulate the land. There's many different possibilities and explanations, and certainly it's not something that would ever be allowed to remain in the official history or even in the collective memory of those that survived. And so, in what manner would it survive? And you'd probably be asking the question, well, why would anybody allow it to ever be seen by anybody? Well, perhaps that was the only way it could have been seen. That it was affiliated with a political satire, that it was merely from the imagination of these two artists. That you can only see certain glimpses of what came before, but it will always be with that questionable element that it's merely a fantasy, that it's not something that really existed. It's from the imagination. Apparently, people had great imaginations during a time when people weren't supposed to be allowed to have a great imagination. Yes, we understand the society of this time was that you were told what to believe and you believed it and you openly expressed it, and how much dissent with that was truly tolerated. Well, I'll just remind you, there was this event in the 1600s from the history that we're told about called the 30 Years' War, which talked about how there was total intolerance. But it's also interesting how the concept of intolerance goes back and forth in our official history. Sometimes we understand there's total intolerance, but then other times there is tolerance. It's very, very intriguing to really look at it. But what do you think these images are really showing? What do you think's really being reflected here? Is this just some sort of political satire representation from the mind of an artist who, either in his spare time or his full time, he was an architect? It seemed like everybody in Italy from this time frame was an architect as either their avocation or their profession, and of course I'm speaking in jest, but yet when you go back and you look at all the officials that we have recorded in history from this time, they all seem to have architect tacked onto their areas of expertise in some way, shape, or form. In fact, even with the construction of the Kremlin, we understand that the architect came over from Italy to the Russian Empire to lay it out. Even though we have other Kremlin-like structures, it just means citadel in Russia, that were constructed and do have certain details of the same elaborate construction as the Kremlin in Moscow. So what really to make of it all? It seems as though we have multiple converging historical events, and yet we have details that do shine true in each of these artistic representations. Really think about what kind of horror these prisons would be if they did actually exist. Of course, we always talk about how terrible prisons can be, and our understanding that in the past, prisons and, of course, the asylums, the ubiquitous asylums that we had in the 1800s, they were not happy places. And that's why over time, as our society officially evolved, we had to close them all down. And yet, for some unknown reason, certain processes are still retained by our current civilization. Now, do you accept the official explanation that that's just because it's the will of the people, or is there another reason for these processes being retained? What do these symbols actually reflect within these drawings, these etchings? Do they really reflect the political satire, or do they reflect some other symbols of perhaps a former civilization, or even the very entity that the civilization fell to? It's hard to say, but there's so many different possibilities, and they're all very compelling. Because when you look at these sketches, you'll see the signs of architecture from this so-called neoclassical period. And you also see many implements of terrifying destruction and torment. So what's really the truth? It's ultimately up to you to decide, but we have so many clues and indications that say otherwise. Horses are something that explain a lot of our civilization's advancements, and clearly they were the main beast of burden in the construction and logistical support of our civilization as we understand it. Yes, wonderful animal, horses, but what's their true capability? Yes, don't blame me for this particular costume on King Arthur. I can't say that it's one that I necessarily agreed with. A very interesting aesthetic for the legend of the sword. We have accounts that there were horse elevators in Manhattan in New York City. Now, what would be the reason to have a horse elevator? Well, there's very little photographic documentation of this. That's not to say it didn't happen, but evidently the explanation is that the real estate at the highest levels, or what we consider the penthouse today, was inhabited by horses. Now, how does this make any sense? Why would you have an elevator just to take a horse all the way to the top floor and then bring it all the way back to the surface where the horse was primarily employed as the main form of transportation, whether it was hauling people around in a carriage or in terms of logistics? It's a very odd account, and I just thought it was something we'd address. What exactly are your thoughts behind these horse elevators? Do they make any sense? Why would anybody bother to put a horse in an elevator and haul it all the way to the top floor of a structure? Could it be possible that there's an entirely different explanation behind these large elevators? For example, if the structures, as we theorized, actually have a different purpose, these tall high-rises or the skyscrapers in New York City, and of course it's the point of historical contention, which city had the first skyscraper? Was it Chicago or was it New York? Well, just depends on the day that you're looking at it. Of course, Chicago claims that it has the first skyscraper. Maybe they both had skyscrapers at the exact same time. Who knows for sure? But if you actually had these powerful and incredible elevators, were they really being used to haul horses, which makes absolutely no sense, to the top floor of these structures, or were they being used to haul something else? Maybe just large numbers of people that were going to the top of the building to board some sort of flying device. Maybe that's just a crazy theory and we shouldn't go any further with it, because it certainly makes sense. It's not an insane true event that horses were hauled into these elevators and then taken to the very top floor. Also think about the logistics of how exactly do you feed horses and then clean up the vast amounts of horse feces that would suddenly compile in these penthouse areas. It's almost as though these people who come up with these explanations don't think of these little details. Now, I'm not suggesting that our history is incorrect, merely questioning some things that I wonder if perhaps there were some mistakes made with the recording of these events. Because we count on the horse to explain our incredible construction, especially with the rise of the United States, the rapid construction of many cities across the United States at the same amount of time. Look at the amount of growth that occurred in the United States between the years 1800 and 1900. Does it make perfect sense to accept it at face value? Or is it possible that really what it was simply a salvage operation? And that as time went on, eventually the technology was repurposed. Yes, you can find some rather humorous photos of individuals taking a horse and bringing it into an elevator, but that's the closest thing you'll find to an image of any sort of horse actually traversing an elevator. You certainly won't find any images of horses going up these actual purpose-built horse elevators that are completely disappearing from Manhattan because the old world buildings are disappearing. But you will find an image like this where it's really just a paradox. So were these actually horse elevators, or did they have a completely different purpose? What are your thoughts on this possibility? Again, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but I will simply say when I think something doesn't make a lot of sense. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me as to why anybody would come up with the idea of hauling horses up and down a building in an elevator. But maybe that is what they did. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we had so many problems in the past and yet were able to rapidly build cities. Now let's look at the lost and vanished. We have numerous accounts in history of those that have been lost on expeditions and have vanished without a trace. These are compelling historical accounts. And I want to start with the example of an entire army that disappeared. The very compelling and interesting legacy and legend of the army of Cambyses. An army of Persian origin from 525 BC, give or take, that was sent to subdue a rebellious Egyptian faction. Legend goes that this entire army of 50,000, I'm always amazed at how we know these details, disappeared in a sandstorm. Now, common consensus among historians and the historicity of this event is that it's merely a legend. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, this army of 50,000 that disappeared was studied extensively. Indeed, there were investigations that continued into 1980. people were trying to figure out exactly what happened to this army. And there's even a historian that has a theory that some guy who wrote his name on a wall that was found was responsible for ambushing and destroying the entire army. And then it just disappears from history. It's rather similar to the Roman Ninth Legion that disappeared in what is today Great Britain or the United Kingdom. Yes, and then that rather, how shall I say, less than sufficient movie from the 2000s, The Lost Legion. But that's where we had many different movies that were giving us different origins for the legend of King Arthur and Excalibur. There's also this particular individual, this being Sequoia, a Cherokee polymath who was involved during the very difficult wars against the Cherokee, and was also an individual who tried to translate the Cherokee language into something that was able to be understood by the settlers. He was a polymath. How intriguing that we have a Cherokee polymath. He was also present at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. As this was a battle that involved General Andrew Jackson from the United States Army, it was naturally an American victory because General Jackson did not lose battles. It's also interesting to note that I recall there was a time when the U.S. Army Command and General Staff did what was called a staff ride to understand this battle. But then for various reasons they stopped going there and ended up studying several Civil War battles around Atlanta. I can't imagine why. We've also looked at the disappearance of Percy Fawcett, the British explorer who was trying to find the lost city of Z. And there's even a more compelling and I'll say a much finer movie that was made in the last decade about the search for the lost city of Z and the efforts of Percy Fawcett to find it. Now, what are we getting at with this lost and vanished, these accounts spreading over a couple thousand years? What exactly were people always looking for? We have the numerous expeditions that we understand that were committed to trying to find the Northwest Passage, the ability to rapidly traverse from the Atlantic to the Pacific by going through the Arctic Ocean north of North America, or in the archipelago of what is today Canada. And then, of course, there's the synonymous Northeast Passage that goes over northern Asia. But of course, the difficulty being is that these go through areas that have a lot of ice in them. But there was this focus to find these passages to save a lot of time. And why is it we still have that very interesting black circle on the imagery today? I don't know. Maybe it represents where the stick actually goes to the globe. I'm just spitballing. I don't really know. But you look at many of these older maps and they do allude to different passages that people were searching for at the time. And there were different names for it. There was even the legendary Strait of Anian. It's also the place where Captain Cook lost his mind, but we'll get to that in a moment. There's even fictitious maps that are on globes, yes, I'm being quite serious when I say that depict the Northwest Passage. You may recall when we did our earlier exploration of the Panama Canal that there was no canal. The only way to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific was to go all the way south beyond the tip of South America, past Cape Horn, which was very dangerous at the time, or to search for this legendary Northwest Passage. And there were a lot of efforts committed to finding this. There is also this legendary allusion to this Strait of Anian, or however you want to pronounce it. And it's also intriguing to note that the land here, what is today the United States, or North America, is referred to as Anian. All these names that we have on these old maps. Word. Well, I know it doesn't say Greater Tartary, so make of it what you will. But then there's these other maps that show us this Northwest Passage. And for whatever reason, there was a lot of effort dedicated by these exploratory expeditions to try to find this Northwest Passage. But how practical is or was it? Well, as we understand it according to official history, it wasn't until the very early 20th century that the Northwest Passage was traversed. We've even got some English privateers that were searching for the Northwest Passage in between preying on Spanish shipping, such as Martin Frobisher here. And apparently with his incredible attire, it enabled him to be an effective privateer and explorer. I mean, really, how exactly would you wear ruffles like that around your neck and work on a ship? Well, maybe it was just a style thing. And then, of course, we have Captain Cook here, or Julian Glover, who he kind of resembles in this image, and we've explored all the expeditions that he undertook, Look at that, Captain Cook didn't need any silly globe, he could actually use a map. How incredible. It's intriguing to note that a lot of Captain Cook's early explorations involved doing cartography around a lot of land areas that are known as Canada. And of course, Canada being affiliated with where the legendary Northwest Passage was being sought. So just think about this. All these expeditions, all this effort for a period of hundreds of years trying to locate this Northwest Passage. All these explorers seeking fame. And keep in mind that they certainly had to be aware that this was in a very inhospitable area. John Ross, the British explorer leading the first explorations trying to find the Northwest Passage in the 1800s, following the work of all the explorers who came before him. John Ross is also stated officially to be the first European that reached the magnetic North Pole. But things didn't go so well on his expedition. His ship became trapped in ice, and they had to abandon it and walk quite a long distance until they were rescued by another ship. John Ross came under controversy because he had offered these incredible maps that showed the updated areas and where there were islands and where the sailing could be, when he misidentified an area as mountains, what he called the Crocker Mountains, when in fact he was actually seeing a visible mirage called Ice Blink. What exactly is going on up there with this Northwest Passage? Why do we still have so much mystery with the area of the Arctic Ocean, as it were? Even going up to northern Canada to this day is very problematic. It's just intriguing that there just doesn't seem to be an exact answer. It's also intriguing that we've got hundreds of years of lost expeditions, even as recently as the mid to late 1800s. And the other thing that's incredible about searching for the Northwest Passage is, even if they found it, of what commercial use would it have actually been? You understand that back during this time frame, these were waterways that would be frozen. Certainly they had to understand that the only time they could traverse these waterways for this Northwest Passage would have been 2 to 3 months a year. I suppose that would have been better than nothing, and you may recall when we studied the efforts of utilizing the Isthmus of Panama to save time, Scotland during this time frame tried establishing a business where they would use a land route to haul supplies across the Isthmus of Panama and then load them up on a ship on the Pacific side. Here's an image showing this ice blink phenomenon, where you apparently have mountains in the distance, but they're not really mountains. How interesting, though, that there's all these unique phenomenons that exist in these extreme locations, whether we're talking the Arctic or the Antarctic area. And why is it that there was such a focus on trying to find this route if it wouldn't have been commercially viable? Well, you can only take it 2 to 3 months a year, and you may recall there's a lot of risk involved in it. Now, here's the question I have for you for today. How many shipping lanes do we actually have that make use of the Northwest Passage? There's also something interesting when you look at the construction of the Distant Early Warning Line, a Cold War effort undertaken by the United States and Canada after World War II. And then we've explored the different poles that we have, the actual North Pole, the magnetic pole, and then the so-called pole of inaccessibility. And then we get to the piece of resistance in exploring for the Northwest Passage, the Franklin expedition. Considered to be one of the most scientifically advanced expeditions launched in the 1840s to finally find the Northwest Passage, continuing the work of John Ross, who believed he was very close. And it's very intriguing that this legend of the difficulties encountered by this real expedition, and it should be noted it is a very well documented historical expedition. There are many pictures, and there's been many books written about it, to include Dan Simmons, coincidentally the individual who wrote Hyperion's work called The Terror, which was named after one of the ships of the two-ship expedition. And there was also the eponymous Terror TV series that came out last decade. Very well acted and yet very, you'll excuse the pun, terrifying series that showed what happened when this expedition disrupted a balance of nature, as though it was alluding to an entirely different set of possibilities that were going on. Now, there's all these images that we have, these very early photos, because remember this was the 1840s, that very well document the individuals on the Franklin expedition, such as John Franklin himself pictured right here. I just always found the detail very intriguing because we understand that photography was in its infancy at this time. But whether you want to call these actual pictures or daguerreotypes or whatever other technical names that we have for these images, some of them are quite striking. Such as this image here of Captain Francis Crozier, who was the captain of the Terror. Now, was this image improved over time? Was it colorized? That would be our understanding. But it is quite a detailed image from the 1840s. And it's not just the expedition leader and then, of course, the captains of the two ships. So here we have Captain James Fitzjames, who in the TV series The Terror was portrayed by Tobias Menzies. He was the captain of the Erebus, which was the flagship of the expedition. But just think about that. We have a photographic record of the expedition leader and the two captains of the two ships. Now the official historical explanation will be, well, this was a very well documented expedition. It had the greatest advances of technology. And if you've seen the TV series The Terror, you've got the acting efforts of two incredible actors who portray the two commanders of the ships. Those being Jared Harris as Captain Crozier on the left and Tobias Menzies as Captain Fitzjames on the right. It's also interesting to note, though, that when they filmed this series, they filmed it in Croatia. They never actually went to the Arctic to film it. That was all done with movie magic. Although here in this photograph from this exact area where the expedition perished, you have the headstones for the members of the crew that died during the expedition. What we understand is that the two ships trying to find the Northwest Passage became locked in ice, and when it became clear that the ships were unable to be freed after a couple winters, the crews then attempted to walk to the nearest settlement, much as they had done in the Ross expedition, and they unfortunately perished. Yet when you look at this particular image here, we think these are drawings. These are clearly drawings that are based on the photographs that we looked at earlier. We have every leader of the expedition very well documented. And I find that very, very fascinating because we have other incredible expeditions that are not quite this well documented. What we understand is that part of the preparation for the Franklin expedition is they had the latest technology at the time. Both of the ships actually had steam engines that were brought from the nascent trains at the time, and their hulls were reinforced. We know the fact, according to the official history, that the ships were locked in the ice because of the victory note pictured here. How very interesting, all the things that they had hand-jammed on this note, and then of course you have the multiple different languages for any other explorers who might be poking around up here in northern Canada trying to find the Northwest Passage, with the request that the note be forwarded to the Admiralty in the United Kingdom. And then of course you have the hand-jammed note at the bottom that talks about the ships being stuck in the ice, and Francis Crozier and James Fitzsimmons, the two captains, after John Franklin had passed away after they had become trapped in the ice. Now, what exactly really happened here? We don't know for sure. We have a lot of speculation. We actually have the book The Terror that speculates exactly what happened, where there was a supernatural event that was involved with the destruction of the entire crew. But it is very intriguing to think that all this effort was put into all this kind of exploration. And then there's the even more disturbing notion, is it possible that there's actually a lot more land up there? Now, again, the official history will tell you that there is nothing supernatural that happened, that these ships simply became trapped in the ice, and that the crews simply vanished trying to walk to the nearest settlement, which was quite a distance away. Although, considering how long they were really out there and how far they had to travel, it's rather intriguing to think of what other possibilities there could have been. Now, I do want to highlight the fact that very recently, we did actually have definitive evidence in terms of what happened to the crews of these ships. It's also worth noting, here we have this incredible monument in Northern Ireland that's dedicated to Captain Francis Crozier, and you can see he's got quite the old world monument that's been dedicated to him. We see the touches of old world architecture, and there's a lot of effort that's been put into it. And it should be noted that Captain Crozier was not the expedition leader, although, based on what we understand of the story, he did the most to try to ensure the survival of the crew. And here we have the monument to John Franklin, the expedition leader who perished, and we notice that it's rather a newer monument or memorial, and it certainly doesn't have the touches of old world construction to it. What an interesting comparison. one would certainly expect John Franklin to have a much more, how shall we say, embellished monument. But for whatever reason, Captain Crozier has what I would dare say is the more ornate monument. But that's just my opinion. And we do actually have confirmation of where the remains of the ships were found in northern Canada and the archipelagos. And here in the areas you can see where each of the ships were found. Yes, they have actually found the hulls of the ship underwater. And you can see where the holes were found and where Victory Point, where they found the note in the very unique built-up little pyramid of rocks that they had, and where the ships were actually abandoned. So what an intriguing story. And then, of course, the historical documentation that indicates the reward being offered to find the expedition or what remained of these ships after they disappeared. Now, you can watch the TV series The Terror to see a relatively accurate documentation in terms of what happened with launching these rescue parties. But officially, the rescue parties never actually found anything. They only had some clues from some of the locals that they had talked to, the local Inuit population, who indicated that the crew was just simply wandering around the ice, trying to make their way to the nearest settlement. Now keep in mind, this wasn't in the 1700s or the 1600s, this was in the mid-1800s, shortly before the United States Civil War. So very, very intriguing with this expedition that all this effort that was very well documented was put into. It should also be noted that one of the other historical details given is that the hulls of both of these ships were reinforced to be able to survive being trapped in the ice. Well, we apparently do have photography of the hulls underwater as they were discovered, just last decade, mind you, when they found both the Terror and the Erebus. Very, very impressive that the hulls of both of these ships survived, being trapped in ice for how many years, decades or longer, and then they're still relatively intact being underwater. Now, I'm not questioning the veracity of these reports. If they tell us that they found these ships, we have no reason to question that. I'm merely complimenting the fact that apparently there was some incredible construction abilities with the hulls of wooden ships in the 1840s that they were able to undertake for both of these ships to ensure that they would survive so the hulls could be located last decade. Because it's exactly what they tell us. In fact, it was just before the airing of the show The Terror that they announced that expeditions had found these hulls. So what exactly do you think about all this? Do you think that this is practicable and that this totally makes sense? Why was there this intense effort to always go to these far-off locations in these tundra environments? Was this all in the name of exploration? And we've certainly looked at this account before, and the understanding is that it was simply for fame and recognition. John Ross had a lot of fame and recognition, at least until he came under criticism for misidentifying the Crocker Mountains because of ice blink. One of the other expeditions that we haven't necessarily explored is the expedition of Robert Falcon Scott to the Antarctica. Again, someone else who wanted to take a lot of effort to go explore some extreme environment to be the first person to do it. Although, as we understand it, in the very early 20th century, Robert Falcon Scott's expedition met with disaster. And he wasn't the first to the South Pole anyways. Bears a striking resemblance to Sky Marshal Inoki. I can't help but find the similarity in this image of Robert Falcon Scott. For some reason it reminds me of Richard E. Byrd, right down to even having the smoking pipe. But there was a lot of differences between these expeditions. But I ask you, what do you think they were really looking for? What were these expeditions really about? What we were told they were about historically? Or something else? Either way, it does seem to be quite an insane true event. Welcome, channel member.
Meredith. A dream to some. A nightmare to others.
Welcome, channel members, and tonight we are going straight to hell, the 7 gates of hell. And you might be asking, why would we want to go to hell? Well, as it turns out, there are multiple accounts of this urban legend concerning the 7 gates of hell, and if you traverse these gates of hell, you'll of course end up in hell. And why are we exploring this? Because it does happen to feature some multiple connections to many themes that we tend to explore as we conduct our alternative research. I wanted to share this with you because I thought it would break up our topics a little bit, and I also wanted to give you some raw, unfiltered Aurelian. So, by all means, you're welcome to complain about raw, unfiltered Aurelian. In any event, we'll start with the baseline account, at least one of the most well-known accounts of the Seven Gates of Hell. And this is a modern urban legend, not myth, regarding locations in York County, Pennsylvania. Two versions of the legend exist. A burnt insane asylum, so right there, red flags going off, deet deet deet, as we like to say, and the other an eccentric doctor. Hard to say which one is more alarming. Maybe it's both. Both agree that there are 7 gates in a wooded area of Pelham Township, Pennsylvania. Pelham Township. Well, it's not that obvious, is it? And that anyone who passes through all 7 goes straight to hell. The location in question never housed an institution. Sure, I believe that. The aforementioned doctor only constructed 1 gate to keep out trespassers. Despite the popularity of this as a tourist destination, the property is privately held. Visitors may be charged with trespassing as a result. And apparently whoever owns this property obviously doesn't want to, how shall we say, utilize it as a tourist destination. I mean, I would say exploit, but, people can make their own decisions, and maybe they really believe you can go to hell, and maybe a lot of people want to go to hell. Ever see The 9 Gates with Johnny Depp? Yeah, that movie will send you to hell in many different ways. There are 2 popular versions of the myth, each with numerous variations. One states the mental institution be located on either Toad Road or Trout Run Road. Nothing wrong with those names either, depending on the source in Pelham Township. It was erected in a remote location so as to isolate people deemed insane from the rest of the world. One day in the 1900s, a fire broke out, and due to its remoteness, firefighters could not reach the hospital in time to save it. Many patients died in the flames, while others escaped and were soon beaten to death. So we have this very awful account, and of course they assure us that there was no historical asylum located in this particular location. Of course, we can find asylums in many other remote locations, and that's why I'm inclined to doubt that particular assertion. And then we have the gates role in the story is disputed. Some say that the gates were put up by the local search party to trap the remaining inmates. Others say that, completely unrelated to the asylum story, an eccentric physician who lived on the property built several gates along a path deep into the forest. Both accounts agree on only 1 gate being visible during the day, but the other 6 can be seen at night. According to the legend, no one has ever passed the 5th gate, but if they passed all 7, they would go directly to hell, that place we all seem to want to go to. And what do they tell us is the reality? There used to be a road in Pelham Township named Toad Road. Again, nothing alarming there. However, it was wiped off the map after Hurricane Agnes in 1972. Toad Road ran along the Codorus Creek and led to the Codorus Furnace. We'll take a look at the Codorus Furnace in a second. Today, there are multiple gates on this property, which is, again, privately owned, and trespassers can be arrested and prosecuted. So don't trespass there, all right? The gates associated with this legend can be found alongside Range Road and end at the old intersection between Trout Run, Range, and Toad Road. Range Road, what is this, a military installation? All can be seen day or night, contrary to what the legend says. Oh, so now they're saying you actually can see the gates, and there are physical gates. The dense wooded area known as Trout Run contains the ruins of a flint mill, likely mistaken for a burnt-down asylum. Indeed. The only detail to back truth up to this myth would be the fact that Dr. Harold Belknap, a practitioner at Westside Sanitarium, lived along Toad Road. He was not eccentric, but actually kind-hearted. Ah yes, as many doctors at sanitariums were known to be. Belknap would often make threatening signs for any trespassers. Well, that doesn't seem to be a kind-hearted person, most likely interested in the legend, with toad-related humor written on them, which was how the road got its name. Indeed. A related myth states that Pelham was named after hell. This is untrue as well, as it's a corruption of Hallam, after Hallamshire, England. Yes, we've got some wonderful debunking. It's almost as if our good friend, you-know-who, wrote this. Notoriety, the 7 gates of hell have received a fair amount of attention. And it is one of the more well-known ones, and Toad Road, a 2012 independent psychological horror film, makes use of the legend. And no, I do not recommend the film, but as always, if you're intrigued in it, look in it and look up the film. It doesn't really give you a good account of what's going on. But we have a couple interesting things here. We have an asylum, we have a doctor who we're told is really nice, but then acts a little crazy, but he's still a kind-hearted individual. But we have this Codorus Furnace here, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that properly, but it's a very interesting word. And oddly enough, the Forge and Furnace District, and isn't this an interesting object? This kind of reminds me of the lime kilns we often see John Levi exploring, and it has many of the same foundations. Quite a structure to just be found out isolated in the forest away from everything, especially when we look at what it was actually used for and what its intention and purpose was. And they tell us it's a historic iron forge in a National Historic District located at Helm Township. Because that's not what it was supposed to be named. It was named after the place in Great Britain because that makes more sense. Okay, we wouldn't call it Hell. The contributing buildings are the Iron Furnace, circa 1836, Charcoal House, ruins of works houses, Ironmaster's House and Furnace Office, and again we have different dates for these, Privy Forge 1800, and ruins of unknown structures. And this is what you tend to find when you go to sites like this, is there are a lot of unknown structures. Rather odd for the mainstream to admit this, but I do believe it's listed on the actual Register of Historic Places as unknown structures. You find that a lot. And that's usually when they're hand-waving things, or they try to say that the structures are too dilapidated, therefore we can't identify them. So when you start to step back a little bit, you realize that there does seem to be a little bit more to this account of these 7 gates. Now, do these 7 gates actually go to hell, or do they merely take you to a place that you think of as hell? Or again, is this just all an urban legend that's gone too far? Well, let's look a little further. But first thing we're going to do is just take a quick little detour and look up the account of William Belknap, because it's very interesting that this Dr. Belknap, who may or may not have been connected to William Belknap. But the reason I call out William Belknap is he was another prominent figure in the United States Civil War. He was a Union Army officer, government administrator in Iowa, we'll get to that in a second, and the 30th United States Secretary of War, serving under Ulysses S. Grant. Belknap was impeached on March 2, 1876 for his role in the Trader Post scandal, but was acquitted by the Senate because they lacked the 2/3 vote to actually convict him. He was the first cabinet secretary in U.S. history to be impeached, and you can see he's got a really gnarly beard, so he had to be a really cool guy. But in any event, he served in the Civil War. He finished up the Civil War, and oddly enough, he served with a unit from the Civil War, which I've tried to find the history for, and that's the 15th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. And oddly enough, you'll find that there's virtually no history for the 15th Iowa Infantry Regiment. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, I'm just saying it's very difficult to find anything on it, aside from a couple commanders, the engagements that it was involved in, but you will find nothing beyond that. You will find no journals, you will find no accounts of who these enlisted men who were killed or died of disease were. You won't even find a list, you'll just find numbers. Now, is that to say that the records weren't lost? A lot of strange things happen, especially when you look into the unit histories of Iowa, a state that we love to say fielded over 10% of its entire population to fight in the United States Civil War, while still being a relatively new state. But in any event, back to Mr. Belknap. And Belknap is also further involved with Iowa, which was rather odd because you see here, he was appointed Iowa's Collector of Internal Revenue by President Andrew Johnson and served with distinction for 4 years. I can imagine he was very popular. Now, I tend not to get political, but something just to be aware of is that Iowa has always considered itself a Republican state, and in the 1860s that was no different. But this individual Belknap was known for being a member of the Democratic Party, even though he would serve on Ulysses S. Grant's cabinet, and Grant was a Republican. Although the other thing that we don't like to talk about with Ulysses S. Grant, we used to, is just how utterly corrupt his administration was. You do have a historical documentation here that indicates that his administration was corrupt. Although who knows exactly what was going on when in the 1800s. Again, this could all just be pie in the sky. But the reason I'm mentioning Belknap is another element of his Inquisition, or whatever you want to call it, his impeachment. I always called it Inquisition because I always found impeachment such a funny political word that we use. But a majority of senators voted to convict. They lacked 2/3 required, and Belknap was acquitted. And then Judge Arthur MacArthur Sr. dismissed Belknap's Washington, D.C. federal trial. Arthur MacArthur Sr., who was the father of Arthur MacArthur. Arthur MacArthur, the individual who won the Medal of Honor in the Battle of Chattanooga, and his grandson, Arthur MacArthur Sr.'s grandson, was Douglas MacArthur, who we've talked about on the channel many times. So, oddly enough, many connections with this Belknap name with things that we've explored. and in fact a location that we've explored extensively. This Belknap individual was involved in Iowa as some sort of civil administrator. And even though, of course, they say he was collecting taxes, because we did have income taxes to support the Civil War, of course, Iowa was just loaded with money somehow because the federal government just showered money on Iowa. That's what they tell us. That's how they built that lovely soldier and sailors monument we've looked at next to the Iowa State Capitol. But they were missing funds, so they needed to have a collector of internal revenue. The mother of all conflicting accounts, isn't it? The reason that I bring up Belknap, though, is we're going to be looking into him a little bit in the future, and I'm going to be sharing some documents and correspondences that there is still access to. Now, once again, it does give you more conflicting accounts about what was really going on in Iowa. To say that it's strange is a significant understatement. And in the initial account of the Seven Gates of Hell, we have the doctor, who we're told really existed, although he doesn't have a link and not much information, with the same name. That indicates that he's from the family. So, I don't know. Coincidence? A lot of coincidences so far in this story. So let's look into some more accounts of the Seven Gates of Hell. So this is another account of some of the myths that we have about them, and we're still in Pennsylvania on this. Depending on who you talk to, what you believe, and what is possible, somewhere along the line you'll be intrigued, no doubt. Society in general tries to ignore the darkness and downplay and shoot a million messages to you about how some things just didn't happen. Completely agree with that. Very accurate statement there. This is especially popular in America. Popular? It's a little bit more than popular. Where we spend most of our time hiding and covering up the ugly of our history. That's the understatement of the year, and very accurate too. Our world has a dark history that every generation of leaders on every level tends to try and write off. Sort of like Ulysses S. Grant writing off all the corruption in his administration, but we won't mention that. Even tiny Hellam Township has gone as far as to publish and try to explain that the name is some sort of misspelling derived from or related to Hallamshire, England. To me, that just doesn't make much sense. I believe it was always meant to have hell in the name for a reason, a truly dark and more plausible reason, like the fact that there is a portal directly to hell right here in my backyard, and was rightfully named Hellam back in 1739, or whatever was actually going on in 1739. I've been close to the location of the Seven Gates of Hell during the day. There isn't much to see for those who don't want to see. I can feel the depths of hell reaching out at night. I can hear the souls call out just like classic Black Sabbath. Oh no, no, please God, help me. Go with me and I guarantee you will experience things you didn't think you could. I believe there was an insane asylum, as one tale goes. Way back in the early days of America, many people were put in asylums, beaten, killed, and banished from society because of their ideology, their speech, their looks, and that they may have been self-made outcasts avoiding contact with the normals of society. Isn't that interesting? Self-made outcasts avoiding contact with the quote-unquote normals of society. And so really in this particular individual, he actually states a lot of what we think of with asylums. Another element, if you will, of stating that there are people who did not want to integrate into the new normal of society at that time, and they would rather go to asylums, although likely they had very little choice. I could compare the activities to what happened in New England, but I'll save that for another time. Basically, the story goes that there was a fire at the asylum one day, which allowed what I call prisoners to escape and wander about the wooded areas outside the asylum, still fairly wooded today. The guards, servants showed up. As they tracked down the patients, they beat them if they put up a fight and even killed them. The ones killed, well, then he talks about the souls, became trapped within the gates. Now, what do I think is really going on with this account? Does Lucius Aurelian believe in hell and ghosts and specters and everything directly? In a manner of speaking, yes, but not in the traditional way that we might think of as hell. Okay, what are you talking about? You're talking in riddles. Well, there's a lot of accounts of these seven gates to hell, and you might be surprised to know that if you actually look this up, you will find that there are no shortage of locations across the land, the nation, anywhere you want to look, that has an account of seven gates of hell. Sometimes they're real physical gates, overpasses, gates, and other times they are just listed as portals. Perhaps the most, dare I say, accurate ones, or the most legitimate ones, tend to be affiliated with the asylum and the location of old world buildings there. And why is that? Because we do have an indication, and based on my own experiences and intuition, that there are old world buildings that do have the positive energy with them, and there are old world buildings that have been subverted or may have actually been built for evil purposes from the very start. Now, I know that's a very strong word to use, but perhaps I should say for malignant purposes or for corrupted purposes. And is it possible that if they were actually experimenting with portals and gates, that they did actually open a portal to a very nasty place, a place that we would think of as hell, a place that in all literal aspects truly is hell? Yes, it's very possible, especially when we look at overlapping accounts of what happened in the distant past. Now, of course, this is going to be derided as some sort of fantasy and speculation, and that's true. But it's a little hard to ignore the overlapping accounts, the fact that this just doesn't go away. And there's a lot more myth and folklore that's affiliated with this. And you can certainly do your own research and just look up Seven Gates of Hell and just see how many locations actually have a Seven Gates of Hell. And look at the different accounts with it, such as this Acid Bridge, this account in the Seven Gates of Hell. And here we're in Illinois, in Collinsville, Illinois to be specific. And in this account, the Seven Gates of Hell are essentially a series of 7 railroad trestles along Lebanon Road in Collinsville, Illinois. These gates, if they've been coined, were all constructed in the late 1800s, again, as the railroads expanded into the former mining town. Yeah, sure. Despite nothing more than genuine structural beginnings, the gates have evolved or devolved, or they always were, depending on one's point of view, into an area that has become urban legendary for hangings. Oh yes, then we even mention the KKK meetings, satanic rituals, and even further paranormal activities. By the way, I've never heard or seen any sort of KKK activity ever going on in the Midwest, but anything's possible. I've just never heard of it or encountered it. It's rather strange that they mention that. The gates themselves have all been covered in graffiti, and some deterioration can be observed. They're also heavily surrounded by wooded areas. And so you look at these old infrastructure railroad bridges or trestles, and you can see they're very well built up. And when exactly were they built? Well, that's a good question, because you always get the feeling that these underpasses themselves are over or older than the roads for many reasons. Or the roads and the overpasses were constructed before the railroads, but who knows for sure. I mean, just imagine the engineering capacity it would take to really do this. Now, could we do something like this presently? Yes. But does it take a lot of effort and a lot of energy and a lot of logistics that was probably lacking in the 1800s? Likely. Of course, it just depends on when we say the roads were built, when were the railroads built. We can debate it all night under the sun. But when you look deeper into some of these accounts, there's always more to it, that these locations do have a little bit more affiliated with them. And indeed, if you get on site and you look at some of the construction of these overpasses, or these trestles, or whatever name you want to call them today, you'll find that there is a lot of elaborate architecture with them, and material that does seem to give the indication of being a stronger material. If you go on site and you knock on some of this material, you'll realize this isn't our run-of-the-mill cheap concrete that we like to use today. And why is it so covered with graffiti? And why do they have these legends associated with these areas? Well, maybe it actually suits the purpose of covering it up. You even have these really strange isolated churches that are old world buildings that are isolated just out in the middle of nowhere. And they tend to be smaller, and yet you recall our account when we explored Dyersville in Iowa. So overall, what's really going on with these 7 gates of hell and these accounts of asylums burning to the ground? I believe that some of these structures were actually established on known intersection points for where they had achieved or experimented with portals. And we've explored portals a couple times on the channel. But what we don't really understand yet, and what I haven't gotten into, is some of the accounts that we have that give very specific location to portals. Now you might be thinking, well, maybe they run on the intersection of ley lines, and why the heck haven't you done an exploration on ley lines yet? Because I'm convinced with many of the things that I've researched and read that ley lines, at least in a geographical function, do not apply the way we think they do. I certainly think they exist, but I think they exist in a different facet. Now, I could be completely wrong. This is all theoretical here. And I'm certainly open to other opinions, other impressions, and other ideas. So by all means, share them in the comments. But what interests me about this is that with the most, how shall we say, valid accounts of these 7 gates or 7 portals going to some other reality or some other land, which is just quite frankly terrifying, and we have many indications that that does exist, that there really are nasty places out there. So for all the difficulties that you encounter here in this particular realm or land that we reside in right now, remember, there are worse ones out there. and perhaps there is the very worst one out there. Yes, direct choice of words, I know. But what are your thoughts about this? What are your thoughts about all these indications of these different portals, these different locations with seven gates of hell? I mean, could it just be people trying to inflame the whole tourism industry and trying to attract people to the local area? Sure. But oftentimes you do have structures like this that are affiliated with these areas. And as we know, that gives a little bit more of a credence to what's really going on. It provides a little bit of legitimacy that there is more than meets the eye. But in terms of all the details and how it fits together, I'm still working on it. And we're all working on it together. So by all means, what are your thoughts on this? And share with everything and share alike. Well, thank you for joining me. Welcome, channel members. Now, a couple of you had asked for me to share the whole concept of what was unique about the Great Famine, or as it's better known, the Potato Famine in Ireland. What's the mystery behind it? Now, I was going to share this as a Prime Explorer exploration, but I realized that some of the details in this are rather important, and perhaps it's something that should be shared with all channel members. So for Prime Explorers, you're going to get another little folk tale along the lines of the Dyersville Horror. But moving on with the Great Famine in Ireland, if you're not familiar with it, what the Great Famine was, and yes, I'm pulling from Wikipedia because they've got a decent summary of it, and quite frankly, a lot of these details are not subject for debate. There was some academic debate on what truly happened, and more appropriately, who was responsible for allowing this Great Famine to happen. And now, if you even question it, your academic career will be, well, in tattered ruins in a record amount of time. No, questioning this is not what destroyed my academic career. I think you already know. And if you don't know, well, go back and watch the Prime Explorer exploration, Academic Dishonesty. I do detail it a little bit there. But it's really not important because it's all the same thing. The Great Famine, 1845 to 1852, constituted a historical social crisis and had a major impact on Irish society and history. And it's in the name. The worst year of the famine was 1847, which became known as Black 47. The population of Ireland on the eve of the famine was about 8.5 million. We'll take a look at the little population chart of Ireland here shortly, and there is something very alarming about it. By 1901, it was just 4.5 million. So you can see that a loss of 4 million people. Many died during the famine, and many immigrated to the United States. That's what the official history says. Yes. During the Great Hunger, roughly 1 million people died, and more than 1 million people fled the country. Seemed like it was more than that over time, causing the country's population to fall by 20 to 25% between 1841 to 1871, with some towns' populations falling by as much as 67%. One would think that a town's population falling by that much would lead to the end of the town. In fact, having a population loss such as this should really lead to the collapse of a nation, shouldn't it? Much like when we study the bubonic plague. I recall asking that question many times. Shouldn't the entire society have collapsed? Well, in Ireland, there's an explanation, and that's because at the time, Ireland was being governed from Great Britain. So, of course, this population was under the control of a different government. There's an explanation. But I could never get over the whole bubonic plague when you had 50 to 75% of the population dying, and yet somehow the entire society just didn't instantly collapse overnight. Reasons. Make of it what you will. The proximate cause of the famine was the infection of potato crops by blight throughout Europe during the 1840s, so the blight wasn't confined to Ireland. Impact on food supply by blight infection caused 100,000 deaths outside Ireland and influenced much of the unrest that culminated in European revolutions of 1848. There is the connection right there. You might recall that's one of our nexus events when we study the reset conflicts. Everything goes back to the revolutions of 1848, almost as though that's some sort of incipient event. I'm not saying it is, it just feels that way. Longer-term reasons for the massive impact of this particular famine induced the system of absentee landlordism and single crop dependence. And if you want to see the effects of that, or rather the historical and movie film entertainment effects of it, then I suggest the film Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, provided on whatever your thoughts are with Tom Cruise. Initial limited but constructive government actions to alleviate famine distress were ended by a new Whig administration in London. Hey, wait a minute, I thought Whigs were just in the United States, but I guess they had them in the UK too, which pursued a laissez faire economic doctrine, but also some in power believed in divine providence or that the Irish lacked moral character, with aid only resuming to some degree later. Large amounts of food were exported from Ireland during the famine, and the refusal of London to bar such exports, as had been done on previous occasions, was an immediate and continuing source of controversy. So you've got people starving, and yet you're still going to export food from starving people. It makes sense, right? Large amounts of food were exported from Ireland and contributing to anti-British sentiment, and some would argue the anti-British sentiment that continues to this day, and the campaign for independence, which officially Ireland did achieve independence. Or did it? Did it achieve independence in the same way that Scotland achieved independence? And then, sort of gave it up in the Treaty of Union. Again, that's the official history. Additionally, the famine indirectly resulted in tens of thousands of households being evicted, exacerbated by a provision forbidding access to workhouse aid while in possession of more than 1/4 acre of land. Ah, yes, those lovely Victorian workhouses that we've explored before. The famine was a defining moment in the history of Ireland, which was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from 1801 to 1922. The famine and its effects permanently changed the island's demographic, political, and cultural landscape, producing an estimated 2 million refugees and spurring a century-long population decline. For both the native Irish and those in the resulting diaspora, how interesting they actually use that word here. That's another one of those words that they don't really like to use. And when I say they, I mean academia or really anybody. It's just not a word that you use. Or if you do, it only refers to one very specific situation, kind of like that G word that we dare not use. Ironically enough, the G word that was only ever successfully carried out against the Gnostics, a name that may not sound like it begins with a G, but actually does. The famine entered folk memory. Ah, you don't say. The strained relations between many Irish people and the then ruling British government worsened further because of the famine. I can't imagine why. Heightening ethnic and sectarian tensions and boosting nationalism and republicanism, both in Ireland and among Irish immigrants around the world. Oh, so they didn't have that sense of nationalism and republicanism before. They needed to be under a famine, and that's what induced it? Rather intriguing, don't you think? English documentary maker John Percival said that the famine became part of the long story of betrayal and exploitation, which led to the growing movement in Ireland for independence. And thus we have it. The potato blight returned to Europe in 1879, but by this time the Land War, one of the largest agrarian movements to take place in 19th century Europe, had begun in Ireland. The movement, organized by the Irish National Land League, continued the political campaign for the three Fs, which was issued in 1850 by the Tenant Right League during the Great Famine. So we're talking about land ownership and all that other hoop and nanny, but yet we've got a potato blight here. And when it returned, the league boycotted notorious landlords. And you can see what a potato looks like that's infected with blight, showing typical rot symptoms. So, in summary, with all the political effects and everything else that we have from this great famine, what it really comes down to is the entire population, we're informed, was subsisting on potatoes. That's right, potatoes are what we eat, to quote Deathstalker in The Warriors from Hell. And we're to believe that the entire population of Ireland, to such an extent, was subsisting on potatoes. Now, you can certainly read the so-called economic reasons for how such a situation came to be. But do you really believe that you could sustain a population on potatoes alone? Does that make a lot of sense, especially given nutritional requirements? Now, I had a family member who went on a total fruit diet. This was a long time ago. And eating nothing but fruit for several months, this individual lost all their hair and all their teeth. And so I find it rather hard to believe. Now, granted, that's one person. I'm not saying that applies to everybody, but how exactly do you sustain a population on potatoes, however the situation came to be? Now, here's something that's rather difficult to look at, or find, I should say. The chart here showing population of Ireland from 1700 to 2000. Now, what you'll see is that in 1700, again, official history, it's just above 2 million. But then suddenly there's this massive increase. And this is the part of the Great Famine or the Potato Famine that's never ever discussed. And I can't imagine why. It's not even hand waved over, it's never even discussed, not even in historical circles. How exactly did the population of Ireland increase to such extents? I mean, you look at this. This really began around 1775, maybe even as late as 1785. The population doubled 4 million to 8 million. Now, granted, you're only talking about 100% increase there. You're not talking about the incredible 1,000% increase that we saw in the United States from 1800 to 1900. But still, in the same time frame, a massive population increase in Ireland, with a population that was subsisting entirely on potatoes. Yes, that's what the official history says. And then the potato blight hit, and all the other terribleness happened. And the next thing you know, 8 million dwindles down to just above 4 million again. And in fact, the population of Ireland has remained rather stagnant to this day and finally started growing a little bit later. But we certainly don't see this massive increase in population that we see in other places, like the United States, even after 1900. Although, looking at the percentage increase in the United States, it is rather insane when you think about 1,000% population increase. Now, you can find all sorts of interesting mathematical propositions that try to explain this. You can find history that talks about the immigration and the rise of the Irish culture within the United States. You can even read about this suppressed event called the Fenian Raids, where apparently after fighting in the Civil War, and yes, in that less than sufficient Civil War movie, which a lot of people call propaganda, and frankly, I would argue that all Civil War movies are a form of propaganda in a way, but that's just my opinion. You're welcome to disagree with me. Gods and Generals, we actually saw two Irish units on opposite sides of the war fighting each other. Now, is there some sort of truth in that? Why exactly would someone flee a land that has a potato blight to go to a land that's engaged in a civil war? Does that really make a lot of sense to you? Was there really nowhere else that they could go? Or was there nowhere else that they were accepted? I mean, he could have gone down to Italy and signed up with Garibaldi and joined that little struggle. I'm sure they would have welcomed the extra manpower. But I'm just speculating here because remember, these events didn't happen in isolation. There were all these other crazy world events that were going on. But it's another one of those rather strange accounts of the 1800s. Now, I'm going to cut right to the chase here. What do I think is really going on? What you have here is evidence. Evidence that someone is telling us that the population did increase, but then it quickly decreased. Now, of course, the modern take on this is that the government was not responsible. They could have responded perhaps a little bit more forcefully. They could have provided more aid. Perhaps they shouldn't have had exports going from an island that was starving. I don't know. But ultimately, it was not an intentional effort to kill the people of Ireland. And by the way, you can look up the numerous famines that were in India all the way from 1700 and the one in World War II that really doesn't ever get talked about for reasons unknown. Well, we know why. And so you can see, oddly enough, in these areas that were facilitated by this same government, they had a problem with famines, but none of them were their fault. Thus is the official conclusion. But what you really have in this hint, though, is why? Why is it that the population rose? Because they developed modern agriculture? That's what the official history will tell us. They improved fertilizers. And suddenly, when you have more food, the population just magically increases. Sort of like you're playing one of those 4X video games. The next thing you know, kaboom, your population increases because you produce more food. Although there's an argument that some, and sociologists, I recall suggesting this when I was a teacher, they said that if you had more food and a more comfortable standard of living, that your population increase was less. Some argue that in places in what we call the third world today, now we can debate which nations we classify as third world, I'm not going to get into that, but that their population grows much faster because of the conditions that they're in, because they're, expecting a lower life. it's, and I don't mean to laugh about it and dismiss it, But it's intriguing that they want to say that one thing is true. Well, if you have more food, that means your population is going to grow. But then here's evidence that if you have more food, your population is not going to grow. But if you have less food, your population is going to grow. So which is it? It's really strange. It's one of those concepts where you get the idea that it's the perception of population that's what really matters. Now, I'm going to jump forward here a little bit. There was a 1990, I think it was early 90s film called Hardware. Now, this was not a high budget film. This was a very low budget film, but this was in the era of the heyday of the VCR, the VHS specifically, and it was when a young Lucius Aurelian was working in the video store, and this film had a rather interesting poster in it, and it features a post-apocalyptic wasteland, a civilization that's on decline. People are dying from radiation and toxic fumes in the air, but yet the point of the plot is the government wants to make a robot that's going to impose population control by killing people. A robot which is called Mark 13. You know, the passage from the Bible where it says, "No flesh shall be spared." Now, I didn't title the video that because we know what would happen if I did. Anyways, none shall be spared. And even though the population is already limited, people are already dying, the government wants to unleash these robots. And spoiler, at the end of the film, there's an announcement that they're going to start mass producing these robots to kill people. It's a very interesting and moody film, and it's amazing to me what they used to be able to do with low production values and yet a little bit of creativity and some good performances. And when you watch this film, it really does feel like you're in some kind of horrific post-apocalyptic wasteland. And yes, you'll see some familiar performers in it, including the guy who flew an X-Wing in the original Star Wars. He makes a cameo appearance, and I'll just say it, he's a bit of a pervert in the film, and he meets with quite an untimely demise. Surprise, surprise. But the interesting thing about this film is, despite being a very low-budget post-apocalyptic sci-fi film from the early 90s, is that it conveys this sense of dread, and yet it conveys this rather strange approach from the government to want to impose population control on what we know and see to be a population that's frankly already on the decline. Who's even survived this nuclear war that seems to have occurred? And there are statements that there's radiation. There are statements that there are still people that are being born, but they're being born in the same way. If you watch that lovely Threads movie from 1984, by the way, there's a follow-up exploration coming on that one. Just wait till you get that one. That's a good one. That your child is going to be born deformed. It's going to be horrifying. And so it's just better to engage in a sterilization program. Yes, that's in the dialogue. Now, while this film may not explicitly show that, the fact that it refers to that and gives you the idea that there really are in this terrifying wasteland, that their existence is horrible. And yet, with a population on decline, with people dying, the government's answer is to send out this robot that's just going to kill people. Yes, my favorite little screenshot there of art. It's a rather trippy scene in the movie, too. See, apparently the robot injects you with toxins that cause you to hallucinate before it kills you. So I'll admit, it's a bit of a trippy movie. I'm not going to say it's a great movie, but was it a good movie at the time, and was it entertaining? Yes. And were the ideas very intriguing and horrifying? Absolutely. And I got to admit, I miss the time when, and I've lamented on this many times, when science fiction was used as a bit of a warning and not just always as, some sort of optimistic view of the future. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate the optimistic view of the future, but I liked it when we had both. I mean, now it just seems like everything is so watered down, and let's be honest, it is, because as I said in earlier explorations, it's derivative. Anyway, you can watch this film if you're so inclined. It's readily available, or you can read the synopsis of the plot and really get an idea to the things that they're hinting towards and what it's really about. Now, how does this relate to the potato famine? Well, it seems as though there is some sort of government response, but the government's not really responsible for what happens. Oh, there was nuclear war, everything fell apart, and people are dying. The government's not really responsible for it. Oh, but we have overpopulation, even though people are dying and people are deformed. So we're going to create a killing machine. And the killing machine is it's self-aware to an extent. It's certainly more advanced than what we call AI now, and it can build itself from parts. Now, one other reference that I'll give you before closing this exploration, there is a very little known film that was very, very poorly funded. In fact, it probably had 1/10 the budget of Hardware. I don't know, I'm just shooting from the hip. It looked like it. From Shapiro Glickenhaus Productions. Now, you might recall James Glickenhaus is the director behind films such as The Soldier and, of course, The Exterminator, early 80s films. A very interesting and independent filmmaker. Now, Moontrap, 1988, stars Walter Koenig, also known as Mr. Chekhov from Star Trek, and he's actually the lead in this film. And then his partner is an astronaut who's portrayed by Bruce Campbell from Evil Dead. Yeah, and these two actually have quite a great chemistry together. The plot's rather simple. They're two shuttle astronauts who come across a derelict in space that's from the moon that has the remains of a human being on it, and then some weird killer robots. And it all originated from some base in the moon. Now, what's really interesting about the movie is despite the fact that it had virtually no budget, and like I said, probably 1/10 the budget that the film Hardware did, they still managed to make some impressive use of matte paintings and convey a sense of scale. Now, whatever you think of space, it's a little bit irrelevant. I mean, it's your classic science fiction movie, so they're going to the moon, it's in the title. There is something going on in the moon. And they encounter a human civilization that was 14,000 years old, but yet it was more advanced than where we are now. It's one of the very rare examples that you have of reference to the past of humans being more advanced than they are now. It's one of those things that makes this film very unique and yet also forgotten. And so Walter Koenig and Bruce Campbell return to the moon, and they find out that there are actually a group of humans there with one survivor that they locate and try to escape with. But they're contending with these killer robots that all start off with just a headpiece, much in the same way that you have with the Mark 13 robot in the Hardware concept. Now, what you see here are all these robot heads that are going to be unleashed on Earth. And what these killer cyborgs do is they reassemble themselves using any sort of spare parts they can, junk or even other parts of human bodies. It's rather disturbing. And like I said, despite the fact that it had a very limited budget, they made the most of it and managed to convey a pretty terrifying and convincing film. And like I said, some of the matte paintings are very impressive that really give you that sense of scale. Now, some of the miniatures, to be fair, are not remotely convincing, but, if you go from that whole, well, it's in space, the more fake it looks, the more real it looks, you kind of embrace it a little bit. You know what I mean? Anyways, I strongly recommend the film and the concept because of the fact that it does convey this horror. And what's interesting about Moontrap and Hardware, are they really talking about the future or are they talking about the past? Was there really some sort of technology that had run amok that its only design was to actually destroy humans? Because I go back and I look at this chart of the population of Ireland. Was that just simply the remaining survivors that were being culled off at that point in time, right around that critical time, 1848, when all those social wars happened? Again, not something I would really want to talk about in open public explorations, but something I'll talk about with you members. What are your thoughts on all this? What do you think about these incredible social unrest events that occurred all around 1848 to 1850? And what do you think about these famines and how terrifying they really were? And my last question to you all is, why do we still have all these monuments to all these famines? They're really bizarre and very disturbing. Well, thank you for joining me. This is Lucius Aurelian signing off. Beyond the Great Plains, you come to the eastern face of the Rocky Mountains, and there the dramatic city of Denver. Denver, located in the current state of Colorado in the United States, the capital city of Colorado, and also the largest metropolitan area in the Front Range Corridor, an urban complex that runs along the east side of the Rocky Mountains. What's the real story behind Denver? We have many modern high-rises that conceal old-world structures, much as we see in other cities such as Milwaukee. And what's intriguing about Denver is that it had a story of very rapid population growth. It has no shortage of very impressive old-world structures. Once again, another location that grew up very rapidly and was in a very remote area, especially concerning ourselves with the limitations of population and technology of the late 1800s, when the city went through its most dramatic population growth. But what's the real story behind Denver? Why is this one of the most interesting old world areas that we haven't explored just yet? There's many mysteries and many hidden examples of what may be the finest old world architecture, and some stories we haven't examined in the secrets of the Mile High City. We start by looking at the bird's eye view of Denver, and I wanted to get a good look in terms of how it's laid out, and we see an impressive population growth going from 4,700 to 200,000 people in 40 short years, or a 4,300% increase. That's your population increasing by a factor of 44 every 40 years. Now, I understand that Dr. Quinn was in nearby Colorado Springs, but how exactly do they explain all these people flocking to this mountainous area at a time when it was remote and difficult to reach? We see in the early bird's eye view map that there are many impressive structures attributed to construction from after the 1860s up until the 1890s. Now, whether people were coming there for jobs, economic opportunity, or the nearby silver mines, which is what we have a lot of the historical account informing us, or the fact that they knew Dr. Quinn was in Colorado Springs, it is a very impressive and unprecedented growth going off the official historical account. And we have many impressive structures that are depicted on this bird's eye view map. And so it gives us the impression that we have a very intricately built and impressive city. Now, many of these structures are no longer with us, but the fact that they are very well documented, such as the Arapahoe County Courthouse, and it should be noted that Arapahoe County was originally part of Kansas territory, and Denver was actually part of the land that was part of Kansas territory, before it became the separate state of Colorado. Interesting structures, though. Wondrous hotels and other impressive municipal buildings that we would not see the likes of today. And, of course, we understand the reasons. And why not have an opera house, too? The Tabor Opera House, named after Horace Tabor. And what do we have here? A National Mining and Industrial Exposition Building? Why not? I mean, it was a very small town. You saw the population numbers for 1870, but we may as well have an exposition. And we see that we have multiple dates written on this. Is this what Denver looked like in the 1860s? Is this a bird's eye view map from the 1880s? Well, make of it what you will. But what I find interesting about these bird's eye view maps is they do correspond with the current layout of all of these cities and towns that we still have around. And of course, we understand that the city was built up around a vast Union Station, the intersection point of many railroads. Although the original Transcontinental Railroad did not pass through Denver. It actually went north through Wyoming, which is why we have that impressive Ames Monument, that little pyramid that's in the ground in Wyoming. What is the story, though, behind Denver with these interesting structures and all these elaborate buildings and this impressive layout that seem to already exist? Now, I'm merely saying that's just what the map makes it look like. Going all the way back to the early history of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when we look at the unfortunate history of the United States westward expansion with what was considered slave states and free states. And you've no doubt read the history of Bleeding Kansas. Well, Kansas did eventually be admitted to the Union as a free state, and then Colorado would fall on. Remember, this is the 1860s. And this is our early dramatic painting, if we will, of what Denver looked like at the start of the 1860s. A bunch of tents, some covered wagons, and some very pretty trees. I really wonder where exactly this artist set up before he painted this very dramatic picture. I mean, it's not like we didn't have photography available in the 1860s or even the 1850s, but this is what we have. We even have this early layout of Denver, and keep in mind, this was before there was really anybody there, and it's very intriguing to me that they already had multiple street names, and even more interesting that we skipped right ahead to 15th Street. Well, maybe they just decided to forego 1st through 14th Street, or perhaps there's more from this map that's not depicted on there. Not really sure what to make of it. There's the usual history that we have of difficulties with natural disasters and other sorts of issues that we have in the other cities that we've explored, and whether we're talking about flooding, fire, Denver is certainly no exception to this. Now, again, remember that the city was built in a very short amount of time. And here in these very early photographs that we do have that are attributed from the archive to the 1860s, we do see some very impressive structures that were already constructed and ready to go. Brick buildings and what looks to be some sort of castle building in the background. I'm sure it was not a castle, it just looks that way. I mean, what are your thoughts on what this structure really is? Why does it have all these interesting little spires on it? What purpose could they possibly serve? Now, there are images that show that Denver was subjected to fire at different points in time from 1870 to 1890. Although, are these fires, or is this some sort of scene that was set up from the film The Day After? I'm not really sure. It's very intriguing. It's hard to know what to make of some of these early images. Ah, yes, and our one image of the mining exposition building. Now, of course, it makes sense. They hadn't really even gotten mining off the ground in the 1870s, but I guess they just had the foresight to know that Colorado, once it did become a state, of course, was going to be the forefront of mining operations, especially off the Rockies. So you may as well build an impressive exposition building off of some new looking railroad tracks. Also interesting that we have coins that commemorate this particular exposition. It was the 1800s, and doing elaborate expositions was just the order of the day. And we understand that all these structures were temporary, and if it was so easy to build such elaborate temporary structures, then why are we still not doing it? Well, maybe we'll get that promised World's Fair coming up in Iowa here in the future. I wouldn't hold my breath, though. And you see some of these other early images that give us the impression that there seemed to be a very developed infrastructure system within Denver. Evidently, they got the trolley off the ground very quickly, and remember that this is out in the westward expansion, or what was still known as the frontier of the United States at that time. But why let a little thing like that keep you from constructing a very elaborate welcome gate? Oh, maybe that's what's missing from cities these days, is we don't have a massive gate on them that says welcome with many operational trolleys and cars. Now we can attribute this to the early 1900s. I like the fact that they have the... Ooh, take a look at that interesting symbol. Now see, that's also what we're missing. Why don't we have interesting symbols like this on our gates? So you just build gates like this and you'll attract people to come to the city, whether there's actually jobs available or not. Although the official history tells us that there was an economic boom in Denver. There was all kinds of jobs from 1900 to 1910. And this attracted immigrants and people everywhere. And that's exactly how we can accept the explanation behind this vast population growth in this very short 40-year period from 1870 to 1910. Now, if you want to do a little fun game with math, calculate what the population of Denver would be today if it continued at this 4,000% population growth. And here we have Horace Tabor, a political party leader, also considered the great silver baron of the area. And he was responsible for starting many silver mines in Leadville and the surrounding area that contributed to the vast economic boom. Although his life wasn't all prosperity, he went from rags to riches to government bureaucrat. Yes, he ended his career as the Postmaster General, apparently, of Denver. What an interesting career path, not exactly what you hear about. And when you try to reconcile what was actually going on at that time, yes, we have one individual who's responsible for taking the economic risks of starting all these mines and was very prosperous, to the point where he has this wonderful opera house that he apparently built, and then he went broke. We have our early Union Station, our very elaborate train station that was always affiliated with the new cities, apparently, because if you don't have a very elaborate train station, how exactly are people going to want to get off the train and stay in your city? So it all makes sense. I mean, again, I'll ask that question, why aren't we building train stations like this today? Oh, that's right, because we aren't bothering with the high-speed rail in the United States. There's a lot of opposition to it, and it just doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a high-speed rail. But don't worry, Amtrak is getting there. And maybe one day they'll get back to building elaborate structures like this. But looking at the early images that we have, we see our interesting mix of trolleys and other means of transportation in the early 1900s. And we also have the very elaborately constructed buildings. Now, I'm impressed going back to the bird's eye view map of Denver and looking at all the incredible structures that were apparently already built by the 1880s. And you saw the population numbers and how incredible that would really be. Because, once again, the official history informs us that Denver really exploded in terms of population from 1900 to 1910. Everybody just wanted to go there. Because, there weren't buildings built yet, or were there? There were opportunities that were available, especially with mining, silver mining, lead mining, and who knows what else was around there. Now, granted, it's not known for being an agrarian area, but they did have, of course, the large stockyards, which is rather intriguing. Now, there's a saying in the United States that some of the finest cattle are raised in Wyoming and then they're sent to Iowa to be processed or to live on the farms. Of course, it depends how you follow the line or the actual lines of logistics. And keep in mind, this is with modern logistics, the interstate system and everything else that we have available in the United States. It's still very impressive, though, that with a limited transportation system, no highways in existence at that time, no interstate system, just the railroad and just horse and cart, they were able to build an incredible city on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. Something else I think we need to step back and take a look at, though, is the accounts of destruction that we have with Denver. And there were numerous fires that apparently occurred that are responsible for preventing us from being able to enjoy these wondrous historical buildings that once existed that were displayed so prominently on the bird's eye view map that we looked at. But whether it's an opera house or something else, you can see that within the great theaters there were always examples of impressive architecture and a focus on artwork and, of course, geometric precision. Because remember all those people that we saw in those early photos, and remember this official historical account that we have of these disparate groups of immigrants from different areas. And yes, I'm saying that word a very particular way, disparate, for a reason. Because how exactly do you reconcile the fact that you have all these people from these different backgrounds speaking different languages that were just able to come together very quickly and seem to operate in a very organized manner to rapidly build this city when no city had existed before? Or rather, many of the buildings were lost in the natural disasters. And you may have noticed that in all of our other city explorations, it's the same story beats that we have. The same historical paradigm that we have, where the United States, every single city, managed to have vast population growth, managed to build incredible structures, such as the the Colorado State Capitol in Denver, that we'll be looking at a little bit later, in a very short amount of time. Now, in all the state capitol buildings that we've looked at, we haven't looked at the Colorado State Capitol yet, and has a rather interesting background to it as well. But oddly enough, it also shares many of the same details that we've come across in the other great cities of the United States. You're thinking about going to the 1800s and trying to put yourself in the mind of whether you're an immigrant from Germany or somebody who's relocating from the South after the United States Civil War, seeking economic opportunities. And once again, you're trying to understand why anybody'd want to go to this particular area. How did word of mouth really get out about the job opportunities? Well, maybe there were people going around dispensing flyers saying that, yes, we need to conduct mining here. There's silver mines and there's other opportunities. There's vast amounts of granite that we can actually mine and process here in Colorado and build these great buildings out of. And that may well be true. And indeed, you have the Rocky Mountains nearby, and so there is an explanation of where these construction materials come from. But still, the fact that all of these incredible buildings were already constructed, again going off of the historical evidence that we have in the bird's eye view map, with a very small population, when we understand that the solution for constructing all these buildings was there was just infinite labor available. Now, I'm being facetious when I say infinite labor, but that's usually the explanation that we have. Everybody was an artisan, everybody was a craftsman, every single immigrant, wherever they were coming from, did have this unique skill set. Unless you want to accept the fact that all you need is a good architect, and then an architect can draw these elaborate plans, and anybody, no matter how unskilled they are, could actually put these buildings together. But we see, looking at these late 1800s, early 1900s images of these impressive structures in Denver, that, much like the other cities that we've looked at in the United States, there seemed to be no limits on the kinds of structures that they could rapidly construct. And not only were they beautiful, not only were they gorgeous, but they had some very interesting intricacies to them. Some unique decorative motifs that, once again, we just don't see in our modern architecture. And we understand that to be because we're not inclined to put the effort into artistic expression in our modern architecture. We're also not inclined to build with construction materials because now such construction materials are prohibitively expensive, despite the fact that we have an improved infrastructure. We have an interstate and a highway system that did not exist in the 1890s up until the 1920s, when the vast preponderance of Denver was constructed that we're looking at in these images. So once again, how exactly do we reconcile this? Well, it's because people worked harder back then. It's because there were no regulations. There was no focus on safety. Although if you look at newspaper clippings from 1850 to 1900, you'll find that safety headlines a lot of things. I'll give you the notorious example of the safety of the shot tower in Dubuque, Iowa. Look that one up about how they emphasize safety. And who actually built all these elaborate constructions and why? Was this just simply from the non-existent municipal funds of Denver as a nascent city? Or were there just wealthy people who decided to come in and develop this area? And that's the other explanation that we tend to get. There were people who had a lot of money, and rather than living in the already developed areas such as New York City or even Chicago, after the fire, of course, and they rebuilt it, because recall that when Denver began its massive growth, 1900 to 1910, there was the City Beautiful movement that was going on across the United States. The City Beautiful movement, where they were emphasizing urban planning, and that's the other explanation for why we have all these incredibly gorgeous photos of these cities in the United States from 1900 onward. This was all inspired by the efforts of the Columbian Exposition out of Chicago. We're going to build our cities in a City Beautiful format. And I guess that even applied to your breweries. That's why they look like castles with smokestacks, because you can't have a good brewery anywhere, whether it's in Utah, Colorado, Iowa, West Virginia, without it looking like a castle. How can you be expected to brew good beer unless you have a castle to go to work in every day? But once again, you look at the early images of Denver, and again, you have multiple conflicting impressions from these images. Was it just some sort of western frontier town with a lot of wooden structures? Or was it something much more extensive with all of these impressive granite and red stone structures, or whatever the construction material we have that's attributed to the particular building? And when we see designs such as this, we have seen these in other cities with this interesting layout that, once again, we just simply don't go with in our modern cities because we lack the capability, or, we lack the desire to do so. There's also some interesting images that show horses on carts, and actually riding in the carts in front of what would be trolley vehicles. What exactly is going on here? Once again, the explanation is using the vast differences in inclines, where Denver's located on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. What you would do is you would have the horses pull the cart where it was needed, or in this case, the trolley vehicle, and then you'd have a little cart in front of it that the horses would ride on. How industrious. Interesting house there as well. But it didn't take them long before they quickly converted all of their trolley cars to operate on the electrical system, and thereby not relying on the poor horses to pull these vast trolley cars all over the place and up and down these inclines, unless of course they rode down the inclines. Isn't it very interesting? And then here, looking at an early image of a very modest high school constructed in the 1920s, Denver East. We'll take a closer look at that in a little bit. And once again, you can see that it conforms to our expectations of how high schools were supposed to be in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because if you don't have something that looks like a large castle, how are people supposed to know that they're in a high school? Here in Salida or Salida, Colorado, pronunciations vary, you have the roundhouse of the great rails. I always find these roundhouses impressive, though, because of the vast magnitude of the layout. And just think of what it really took to build these structures. Now, also think about the fact that we're operating here in the high elevations of the Rocky Mountains. And recall the limitations on slopes that rail cars and locomotives at that time had to operate under. In other words, the steam engines did not do a very good job of going uphill, so they had to operate on level surfaces. And it's also interesting to note that this wondrous roundhouse here was once again a victim of another fire. Was this an act of negligence or something else? It's hard to say, but we see another example of a fire destroying a very impressive structure that on first glance seems like it would be impervious to fire. Now, trying to reconcile the story of all the infrastructure developments of the railroad with what actually happened in Colorado is very intriguing. I find it very impressive that not only was the Transcontinental Railroad built, going through Wyoming of course, but in the fullness of time, they did lay out all these railroads in Colorado. I mean, you needed to have some means of getting all this silver, all this granite, and all these other incredible materials that you could mine in and around the Rocky Mountains out of there to the more wealthy areas, or at least the more developed areas of the United States at that time. But you once again see the interesting images that show some of the limitations with the railroad, at least until subsequent images where we see that it's almost as though the railroad became much more advanced and then was abruptly neglected. And of course that time frame conforms with the advent of World War II, apparently, because that's where you'll see most of these advanced locomotives from the 1930s. Ah yes, Cheeseman Park here in Denver. And we'll take a look at some images of this very impressive neoclassical structure that was in an area that was originally stated to be a cemetery. But then they converted it to a park. Well, that sounds like an all too common story once again, and hopefully not doing a repeat of the film Poltergeist, they didn't neglect not to move the bodies, but who knows for sure. And you can see that much like our other cities, with the old world element of these cities, or the surviving historical buildings, are now being surrounded by these very impressive modern high-rises. And as some people will tell me in the comments, you should appreciate these modern high-rises because they're an example of art. Here we have the Daniels and Fisher Tower, one of these impressive early skyscrapers from Denver, attributed to 1911. And you may recall in some of the other cities, such as Seattle, where we've seen similar towers, this particular tower is no exception. Once again, the ability to build in such a format. Now, I really wonder if the theory goes that there were other larger structures that had to be torn down or removed, because we can see that this particular tower is somewhat more modest than what we'd expect, especially compared to the modern high-rises. We have to ask the question, is it possible that only certain buildings, such as this tower, were designated to survive for whatever reason? And there's a lot of interesting details behind this particular tower. Why exactly was it designated to survive? Why, despite the fact that it's much shorter than the surrounding massive skyscrapers, does it have more detailing in it? Why do we have construction photographs such as this that are, at best, puzzling, and at worst just, well, outright ludicrous? Because what's going on with the sky? Why does the scaffolding not match the construction materials? What exactly is going on right at the divide line right here? Now, I'm not suggesting that this is some sort of fabricated photograph, just that it looks very interesting. The other old world signs that we have for this particular tower, in terms of its different appearance and color, depending on the daylight, something that seems to vary much greater with what we would consider to be old world structures. And then, of course, we have some of the intriguing symbols that we've come across in many other structures. And here in the Daniels Fisher Tower being no exception. We, of course, see our interesting pantheon of gods and goddesses that we seem to have. And, oh, yes, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our favorite cartouche that makes another appearance here on the front of this balcony area. And why exactly was there this movement and all this artistic expression on these structures in the early 1900s to venerate the classical deities of Greece and Rome? I don't know, maybe it was just a really cool thing at that point in time. Looking at some of the other exterior architecture, though, you can see that it does seem to be sectional in a way, but it's still impressive that it is in a what appears to be modular construction format, because imagine laying out all these different pieces and putting this together. Now, in some of the older images, we do have some clues in terms of how ornate and impressive this particular structure really was at one point in time. Here, looking at the ceiling of this particular room, and we see the incredible decorative elements that we've come to expect in genuine old world structures. We also see the layout here at the, what I'm guessing is the baseline or the main gallery of this particular structure. And we see floors that go up. So I wonder if there is much more of a story that's been lost over time with this particular building. Because it seems as though it's been renovated many times and there's been vast changes to it. And of course we can see how the base department store and the tower itself has been changed over time. Was there also some details that were lost with the original bell tower that always seem to be included with these structures? And again, going back to the theory, what if there were other taller, more elaborate buildings that just simply had to be brought down or didn't survive whatever events transpired in the 1800s that we may not know the exact details behind? Again, it's just a theory. But in this particular image, again, you have hints in terms of how opulent and impressive this structure really was. And yes, I say opulent because it should and could have been prohibitively expensive at that time. There were vast economic limitations in 1911. The Federal Reserve hadn't even been started yet. Now let's take a look at Denver East High School, 1924. Now this is attributed to the Roaring Twenties, so at least we have some consistency with the economic prosperity going on at that time, and Denver being no exception to wanting to build impressive castle high schools. Now this is the earlier structure that was Denver East High School from the 1800s, and we can see that it is very impressive and well laid out. Maybe that's the reason why we have struggles with high schools in the United States, because we don't build them in terms of these opulent castles anymore, or opulent chateaus, or whatever you want to call them. It's without pier, settlement, or crack in its walls. So that's no doubt why they had to tear it down and replace it with this beauty in the 1920s. It was without pier and it had no structural defects. That's the perfect reason for why you need to knock a building down and replace it. Because obviously you have no economic limitations. That's why I always find that whole debate about the fact that, well, we just don't have the money to do anything today. I don't want to hear that. I really don't. And when we look at Denver East High School, we can see that it contains a little Michelangelo modification there, or at least a scale model that is covered up so it's appropriate for the students in high school, until they're supposed to learn about such things. An interesting exterior ground, too, with the Denver High School, where we see other monuments. And then looking at the interior, and much like the building that we just looked at, we see the same story within this high school. We have hints about how incredibly decorative and wondrous this structure really was in the past. Now, are there older images? Yes, there are, that do give us that impression that this really was a much more ornate and elaborate structure, especially on the interior, than we're giving it credit for. Now, in our explorations, we're well aware of the fact that these, what we classify as old world buildings, have difficulties with surviving intact and unmodified to the modern day. Now, once again, the official explanation behind that is that these buildings were so poorly built when they were erected, even though they say that they're without pier and that they have no cracks and no structural defects, they needed to be modified, they needed to be renovated relentlessly. And that's why we don't see these incredible reading rooms, these libraries, and these auditoriums from these buildings that are high schools that we were somehow able to easily construct in the 1920s. I know, it was the Roaring 1920s. Yes, it was after the Great War, and it was before the other Great War, World War I and World War II, and it was at a time of economic prosperity for the United States, which would end just as rapidly as it began. But don't worry, it wouldn't stop people from building impressive structures. I mean, how could you have a high school without a cool clock tower like this, and a very interesting cupola with a dome? And then even looking at the exterior grounds, we have other questionable elements, such as this interesting fountain. And what exactly is this constructed out of? Is this what we would think of as modern concrete? Is this Portland cement? Or is this something else entirely? Have they ever had to renovate any of these structures? Have they had to renovate this entry gate? Is this a newer entry gate? Or is this just an older surviving piece of the original high school? And what exactly is with this interesting lion motif? And we have the Denver City and County building constructed in 1932, and this, of course, attributes to our construction capabilities even during the Great Depression in the United States. So, how badly was Denver hit by the Great Depression? Well, apparently not badly enough that it would preclude the construction of this city and county building. And we can see that this city and county building is very impressive on the exterior. Apparently, they inform us that when this construction was originally done, it had to be short enough so it wouldn't block the view from the Colorado State Capitol from seeing the mountains. How interesting, given the fact that the entire city is surrounded by mountains, that they had such a constraint. Isn't that a lovely obelisk in the foreground there? And so, when you see images such as this, it sort of goes against what your expectations for Denver would be. Now, I'll admit the very first time I ever saw Denver was in the opening credits of the old TV show Dynasty. Yes, that was the very first time I ever saw Denver in any way, shape, or form. I hadn't been there before. For whatever reason, in the travels in my life, I've only ever gone to the airport. Yes, don't worry, we're getting to that. But I never really got on the ground much in Denver before. And it is quite intriguing to me how we have this city that you would think, especially at the time of the late 1800s, early 1900s, was isolated in the mountains, and yet it had this incredible explosive growth. Now, of course, you would just attribute that to the fact, well, the entire United States was going through incredible explosive growth from 1890 to 1920. And not just in Denver, but everywhere. So if I were an immigrant coming into the United States, what exactly would draw me to Denver? Why wouldn't I go to New York City? Why wouldn't I go to Chicago? Why wouldn't I go get my free plot of land in North Dakota, South Dakota? Get myself a farm in Iowa? The point being, there's many other opportunities available. You could really go anywhere. So it's very interesting to me to try to deconflict that. Now, of course, we look at the earlier Arapahoe County Courthouse from the 1800s, and we can see a very impressive structure. And for whatever reason, I'm going to go online and say that this seems to be an even more impressive structure than the city and county building that we just looked at. Why would anybody ever want to tear something like this down? Well, of course, you can look at the official historical account and you'll understand that there were apparent structural defects with this, that there were other issues, that it just wasn't going to be suitable for the needs of such a rapidly growing city. Yes, imagine if we still were able to build structures like this, and it even includes a nice little statue on the top of it. And I suppose this statue is going to be attributed to something such as mining. I'll only show one image here showing the tragic destruction of this building, demolition of this building, and it occurred in the 1930s. I guess it wasn't part of urban renewal. There's many other structures to observe in Denver, such as hotels, and I recall our exploration of Hotel Tartaria a couple months ago, and once again we have these unique castles that became hotels, or chateaus, or whatever name you want to call them, manors even. Wonderful turrets and great chimneys and very intricate construction. Were these purpose-built as hotels, or did they have some other incipients in their origin story? Could it be that there's some other purpose behind these structures that we don't fully understand or comprehend? And whatever names we assign to these hotels, and this is just a perfunctory look at Denver overall, whether it's the Windsor Hotel or all these other names that we have for these hotels that seem to repeat many times, much as the town names repeat many times across the United States, what's the real story behind it? And there's even some stories of perhaps some very interesting paranormal phenomenon that occurs within these hotels. Yes, the visibility and the appearance of ghosts that have been reported. Now, are ghosts real? Are they simply a product of our imagination? Is it some sort of reality breakdown? Or is it just simply in the mind of the humorist and it's all a Ghostbusters situation? It's hard to say. I certainly can't write it off, though, because there are far too many reports to simply ignore. And it's interesting that they're always associated with these old world structures. Could it be possible that there's another dimension or even another function to these old world structures that we don't fully understand or comprehend yet? Is that the reason why we see these elaborate hotels in every location? And it is amazing to me that in every single city and town, even the most subtle of hotels, had a lot more grandeur that was associated to it. And I know the explanation will be it was just because the nation and the people at that time valued artistic expression. We just don't today. Ah, yes, we have a mining exchange building. Because remember, this is in the middle of mining country, so why wouldn't you have a mining exchange building? Consider all the grain exchange buildings and the cotton exchange buildings and every other exchange building that we have. Very interesting designs on the top of this particular structure. Little triangle and, of course, another little statue. Does that guy have a pickaxe or does he have something else? And the University of Denver, and yes, our great universities everywhere across the land with some of their very impressive structures. Is this an old main building with a smokestack in the back? If I was just looking at the structure, would I think this might be a brewery? Well, prior to doing these explorations, I never would have thought it was a brewery, but now, yeah, I could actually see it being a brewery. What exactly is the construction material on many of these buildings in the University of Denver? Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on the exact nature and the origin dates of these buildings, but it is interesting just to walk on any university, any college campus, or heck, if you find one of those old military schools nearby, and yes, they're all over the nation, they're not just in the South, as some people would have you believe, it's intriguing to think about how they're able to build such structures. Now, have some of these structures been modified or changed or renovated or part of urban renewal over time? Maybe. I mean, Why doesn't every stadium have a lovely tower like this? And even if this has been modified or built in more recent times, it is very lovely and very intriguing. And that's the interesting thing about universities. There has been some renewal and change done over time. Was this an original building? Is this a building that's an amalgamation of old world and, how do we say, fifth era construction techniques? It may be possible. And again, we're just doing an overview. The Red Rocks Amphitheater, a project of the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. The New Deal strikes again. So when you have a Great Depression going on and you have many people out of work, you create work for them. And who better to do that than the federal government of the United States? And through the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, which provided labor and also materials apparently, they decided to build this impressive amphitheater here on the west side of Denver in this very impressive rock formation. Now, this rock formation has had many different names. And you'll see these names repeat in places like Colorado and frankly all over the nation. Garden of the Gods, Garden of the Titans, or Castle Rock this and that. And it should be noted, you can see why people would think such things. Is there a deeper story, though, behind these interesting rock formations? Or are they just natural rock formations that are very dramatic, and because people needed work, and remember, if you ever watch the TV show Suits, you'll see the character Harvey oftentimes justify his morally questionable actions by saying it was all in the name of jobs. You can understand why a city such as Denver was able to carve itself out of this rather empty plain area on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. Or maybe you don't understand it. Maybe it just doesn't make a lot of sense. How is it that it went from nothing to this in 60 short years? That's an impressive amount of development. Every single structure, every road, every railroad, everything that was laid out where there was nothing. And a population that today is nearly 750,000, and no, that is nowhere close to the number that you'd have if you had that 4,000% growth that continued hypothetically until 2040. I'm serious, calculate that number. It's rather eye-opening what the population of Denver would be today if that percentage of growth continued, as it did from 1870 to 1910. Very, very impressive, though, this amphitheater. And there's something else that's unique to Denver. The U.S. Mint in Denver, and we really haven't explored any of these mint buildings before, and I thought this was an opportunity to take a look at it. Now, it should be noted that on this postcard here, this is just a representation, we're looking at the U.S. Mint and how it's laid out with other impressive structures, to include the Colorado State Capitol. And it's just this modest building, it appears, and this is where they mint the coinage from the U.S. Treasury. And yet, looking on the interior of this building, you see something that you would not expect to see in a building that's simply used to mint coins. Once again, impressive geometric precision and artistic expression. Why exactly would this ever be needed in a mint building that's purpose is simply to create coins? Now, when you look up a lot of the public images of the U.S. Mint in Denver, you will see that they're very limited, such as this particular image. It doesn't really give you an idea of the entire layout of the building. And from the exterior, to be fair, it is a rather modest-looking building. But once again, when you look at the details, you get the impression that there's a lot more to it. It does seem to compare to some of those early 1900s courthouses and structures that we've looked at with all other sorts of different purposes across the land. Not just the United States, but Europe and everywhere else for that fact. What exactly is this exterior construction material? Because it does have some very fine detail to it. And you'll see it in random places all over the nation. And of course, they're always assigned to government buildings of some sort of purpose. They are post offices, they are courthouses. Well, in this particular case, we have a U.S. Mint building. That's part of the Department of the Treasury. And so, since this is our first look at a mint building, we need to look at the architect, Mr. James Knox Taylor, first supervising architect of the United States, appointed under the Civil Service, or whatever we were calling it at that point in time. Ah, yes. So, once again, we have an architect. We have an architect who is responsible for many structures. And if you look up this particular individual, when you have a name like Knox, that's just, a path to success. I could even argue it's more than McDonald's is a path to success in the United States. And this Knox had his own entire crew of architects. Ah, yes. These look like the kind of individuals that would just get out on the ground and be doing this kind of hard work themselves. Or at least I could say there's actually an entire team who are laying out designs. And this individual has many buildings associated to him beyond just the U.S. Mint in Denver, and here we're actually seeing the entire modest building. Although when you look at the details, it's not quite so modest. And especially when you look at the interior, once again, it's not really what we'd expect for a building that's designed as to mint coinage, right? But there's other structures, such as this post office here in Mineral Wells, Texas, or is it Mineral Works, Texas? Anyway, town in Texas, where we have this very impressive post office that's also attributed to this impressive architect. And it also has the slant construction style at that time. Why not? And why stop there? He's also responsible for this impressive post office in San Francisco. That is to this day used as the Ninth Circuit Court. Federal court. Yes, always the impression for what these buildings are going to become. If it's a post office, it can be a great courthouse building. Why not? But why stop there? We have this impressive post office in Buffalo, New York. Again, attributed to the same architect and his team. But again, a little bit more of a credible historical account because it's not one architect. No, he's not E. Townsend Mix. He had a team helping him. Why exactly did he need a tower with elaborate ornation on that in Buffalo? I don't know. Even a post office in the relatively small and isolated town of Creston, Iowa, in Union County. Don't get me wrong, they got a great county fair down there, but why exactly did they need a post office like this in the early 1900s in Creston, Iowa? Well, it's no longer a post office, it's now commercial space, so there you go, the signs of progress. And going back to the U.S. Mint in Denver, what exactly do we see on the interior? This is not what we'd expect at all. This incredible beauty in these corridors, this main gallery with these unique and impressive lights. This is just supposed to be a treasury building. And at that time, given the fact that hard currency money was the only means of financial transactions, wouldn't just having a garrison building easily guarded make more sense? There's also these interesting murals that are featured inside of this mint building in Denver. And they represent interesting things. Trading, mining, commercialism, I guess, if you want to associate it with that. Looking at the front, though, with that sign there, United States Mint, and then comparing and contrasting what you have with these actual figures, the layout of the blocks and the stones, and even the very fine surface on these individual blocks. I wonder, is it possible for anybody to do something like this today? Could a contractor do that? Let's look at some random and old and new structures in Denver. And here, going back to Cheeseman Park, where we have this random, what we'd probably phrase as a neoclassical structure over what was apparently a cemetery, or designated to be a cemetery. There were some issues, though, with this cemetery, and I guess they just decided to transition it to a park. I mean, why not? If you went to the trouble of building a structure like this, I mean, nothing says park like this random neoclassical structure, or whatever architectural terminology we want to associate with it. And if this was in Scotland, we'd probably refer to this as a folly. Or maybe we'd say it's a national monument we were building for veterans that we just ran out of money for. Ah, yes, and some other interesting monuments in Denver. Yes, I'm not exactly sure what these initials or symbols stand for, but it's just very, very interesting. And of course, looking at those symbols across the top, we have encountered those symbols in some other locations before, but for some reason it's just escaping my memory. Oh, and on the topic of monuments, the Tower of Memories, constructed in the 1920s, a very incredible mausoleum. Yes, this is just the kind of effort you would expect to see people putting into a mausoleum. Well, once again, it was the roaring 1920s, so I suppose the economic situation suits that construction, and if it was built during the 1930s, we could attribute it to the 1930s. This is apparently a cable car building with a nice smokestack on it. And even this structure, attributed to the early 1900s, we can see has a lot of impressive architectural detailing on it. And like all the other structures in Denver, it is hidden amongst the modern, impressive commercial buildings. And we would be lost if we didn't have an equitable building. Yes, this is referred to as the equitable building. Another building that was apparently very equitable, that was easily constructed at that point in time. Now again, I'll ask, could anybody lay out a building like this today? No. I'll tell you what we're laying out today. Structures such as this. Ah, yes. Modern architectural wonders. Now, I'm going to give them a little bit of credit on this particular structure in Denver because at least they're trying to decorate the simple glass exterior by putting some sort of facading around it. Although I've got to admit it reminds me of some kind of hive mind for some reason, but maybe that's just me. Oh, yes, and the Wells Fargo Center. Everything's always a Wells Fargo Center to this day in many different cities. So much detail in this building, and so impressive the amount of effort that they went into in laying this out. I mean, look, they have a couple curves on the top of it. I'm impressed. Maybe you are too. So Denver's gone through a lot of change since its initial settlement and rapid population explosion in the very early 1900s, going from this modest police car to this very interesting structure here in the background. And again, I'd really like to figure out exactly what kind of material it's constructed out of. I know it's in Colorado, it should be granite, such as the Colorado State Capitol, built from 1886 to 1903, and I add a question mark because there are numerous conflicting accounts on the construction of the Colorado State Capitol. And it should be noted that their dome, they changed it from copper to gold. And as we learned in the state of Iowa, gold is very cheap. In fact, it's cheaper to build with gold than to paint with gold. So obviously gold is cheaper than copper. But we have early images of this Colorado State Capitol whenever it was actually constructed because, as I said, it's a little difficult to discern from the historical accounts. Some say it was built in the early 1890s. Others say it was from 1886 to 1903. Did they build it in different pieces, components? It's hard to say. But we can see that there are impressive structures around it in some of the early photographs. And so I guess if we're going to compare the Colorado State Capitol to the Iowa State Capitol, while it may not have 5 domes, it does have a lot of impressive structures around it, not the shacks that we saw around the Iowa State Capitol. And of course, it's built up on a hill like every other single state capitol seems to be. And here we can see what appears to be the early copper dome. Although, was it actually copper at this point in time, or was it something else? It's hard to say. But that's what the official historical account tells us, is that they originally built the top out of copper. The work of architect Elijah E. Myers. And you may recall that Mr. Myers here is attributed to other state capitals, such as Michigan and Texas, that we've explored before. And, once again, if you have an architect, that's really all you need. And again, there's other conflicting accounts about this individual laying out the plans for the Colorado State Capitol, and then other individuals that had to follow on and complete the work. Which is very interesting because wouldn't there be disharmony in the construction of the structure? Well, the answer is absolutely not. We've got numerous examples of impressive cathedrals and other wondrous structures that were built across Europe over a period of 100 years. So, in under 20 years, it would be easy to do this Capitol building. You could always get E. Townsend Mix on speed dial and have him come over and finish the architectural plans behind this building. And like I said, in a lot of the earlier images that we have of the Colorado State Capitol, there are other impressive structures that are around it. And if you go out there today and take a look, it is very interesting how the landscape appears. Oh, this is nice. Erected in the 1850s, the old Capitol building. You see, that's what we'd expect. But old Capitol building of what? Colorado wasn't a state in the 1850s. Is that just some sort of joke? I mean, and it's not like the Iowa State Capitol that was originally in Iowa City, and then they moved it to the temporary building in Des Moines, and then they built their impressive state capitol. And we do have some construction images of the Colorado State Capitol that I think should alleviate any crazy theories that we have about a different origin behind this building. I don't see any issues with any of these impressive construction photos. I certainly don't see any scaling issues with these individuals and the actual cupola of the dome, and I'm sure you don't either. This all makes complete and perfect sense, much like the early construction images that we have of, say, the Cathedral of Learning in Pennsylvania. Because why not? Always interesting, though, how we have the baseline constructed first and then the dome constructed second. So in other words, the photos are showing us that you build from bottom to top. Well, that makes sense, does it not? Except for churches in Omaha, where we could build them from top to bottom, after we remove the ground, of course. Looking on the interior, though, of the Colorado State Capitol, you'll see that there is the beautiful ornate detail. And none of the construction photos show the actual interior construction, much like in every other situation that we have, because, well, it would just be boring, difficult, and prohibitively expensive to get photos of the interior construction, I suppose. How exactly was the cupola and the interior of the dome laid out? Now, we've looked up at many domes in our explorations over time, and how do you feel that the interior of the Colorado State Capitol dome compares with some of the other domes that we've looked at? And, I'll go back to building number 1 in this channel, the Iowa State Capitol. Remember what we get when we look at that dome. But I'm not selling the Colorado State Capitol short in any way, shape, or form. it is incredibly beautiful, especially on the exterior, where we see the multiple colors that are always exposed whenever we look at old world buildings in different lighting conditions. And yes, I'll go on record and say it. If you want a successful, long-lasting marriage, I suggest you get married in an old world building, because those seem to be the marriages that really last. It's a bit of a joke, and at the same time, it's a little serious. And of course, you have to understand that the great lawmakers of the United States and any state can only make actual laws with authority if they're doing so in a very beautiful and ornate building. It all makes total sense, and this is why the vast amounts of taxes collected need to be devoted to constructing these impressive buildings. And again, go back to that construction photo that we had. Now, maybe they were just building like a scale model of the Colorado State Capitol. Maybe they were just testing it. Maybe there's some other inconsistency with a construction photo. I don't know. I'm just trying to come up with explanations. We do understand, though, that there's an abundance of granite and other construction materials that are available nearby, so perhaps that's not as difficult of an explanation to accept in the great state of Colorado. But it's still very interesting when we look at this material and reconcile where it is. And we'll look at the Denver Airport in 1994, and you're probably asking, why are we looking at the Denver Airport? This is very much not an old world structure, and I would agree completely. But it just so happens that there are a lot of theories that people aren't supposed to have that are associated with this airport. And it really begins with this dedication plaque here, or monument, or whatever we want to call it, Denver International Airport. I don't know what that sign is. I've seen it before. I'm not really sure what it represents. March 19th, 1994. Can anybody tell me what the heck the New World Airport Commission is? I tried to look up that organization and I couldn't find it anywhere. It's just very interesting. Does anybody know what the New World Airport Commission is? And out in front of the Denver International Airport, you have Lucifer. Yes, the blue Mustang, who looks like some kind of horse that's come right from the 9th level of hell, to include glowing eyes. Now, you have to ask this question. This structure was built in 1994, and there's all sorts of theories that are associated to it. For example, is there something very strange going on with this airport? Does this airport connect into some sort of strange underground transportation system? Or is it all just an impressive coincidence? Why on earth would anybody put a horse that looks like this out in front of an airport? You almost get the impression that this is one of those things that's designed to draw our attention. Well, it certainly does get our attention, and that's why I'm devoting attention to it. I mean, really, I could even say this looks like one of those zombie horses that was ridden by the White Walkers in Game of Thrones before that show went right off the cliff. But very, very interesting and impressive sculpture or statue or whatever you want to call it. And as we understand it, the number of quote-unquote conspiracy theories that are associated with the Denver airport, the airport actually takes them in stride and has fun with it. I mean, looking at this particular mural here, what are we supposed to make of this? Well, maybe we need to get Mark Singer on speed dial or add to our contact list and call him because we need help. There is also interesting murals that have been displayed within the Denver airport at some point in time, and I'm not exactly sure what they're supposed to represent. Now, again, going back to that idea, is this just something that's designed to draw our attention? And was that really the intention behind all this? Something just to keep our eyes focused on so we're not looking elsewhere? I don't know why, but that mural always reminds me of the film Wizards, the 1970s animated one. Apologies for the noise, it takes really big drills to get to the underworld. I can't imagine what particular theories they're embracing here. Is there some kind of salamander people that they're actually employing to work here? I'm not really sure. There are other odd sculptures, such as this really bizarre gargoyle popping out of your suitcase. This gives me an idea for a plot for a new movie. A gargoyle that hides in your suitcase and pops up and terrorizes people. We'll see if there's the film called The Suitcase Gargoyle. I mean, it would be an original idea, so we'd never see it. And then looking at some of these other murals, what exactly do these represent? Or are these just simply designed to be as, how shall we say, strange and as bizarre as possible to gain our attention? And is that really the purpose behind this? Much like it's the purpose behind a particular area that has a number after it. 51? Or is it 52? Just kidding. But these murals are always very intriguing. And I ask you to compare these to some of the murals that you see in the U.S. Mint in Denver, and really compare and contrast what's being expressed. I mean, what do you think these images represent? Do they represent anything, or are they just free artistic expression? Do we just like to remind people that there could be a really bizarre gargoyle that pops up in your luggage after you get it from baggage claim? And one thing I'll say about the Denver airport is the times I've flown through there, I have never really had a good experience, but maybe that's just me. In fact, one of my longest layovers because of flight delays occurred in the Denver airport. So what exactly is going on with these murals? Are they really just there to be the free-form artistic expression? Is this just simply a place that we're supposed to fix our attention to? Or is there something to these theories that people will assign to conspiracies that are labeled on this place? And why don't more organizations just have fun with conspiracy theories? Well, let me tell you about the ultimate conspiracy theory with Denver Airport, and that's the presence of Elway's Steakhouse. Yes, John Elway, the heroic quarterback of the Denver Broncos, who opened his own steakhouse in Denver Airport. Yes, this is the place you want to eat. And you even have an image of the man himself with a great steak right here, and I can tell you that this would be a place that I would want to eat at no point in time. Actually, I did go eat there when I was stuck, and it was probably the best part of the experience. Unlike the steakhouse of a certain quarterback in Green Bay. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.